Adventure of Faith by Shraddha. Published by Science of the Soul Research Center. Print copyright 2009 and audio recording copyright 2025. Science of the Soul Research Center. All rights reserved. Contents. Preface. Introduction. Part 1. Called by Name. Chapter 1. When God Becomes Fate. Chapter 2. Living in the Face of Death. Chapter 3. In Search of the Way. Chapter 4. Leaving the World. Chapter 5. The Garden Inclosed. Chapter 6. In the Sign of Fire. Chapter 7. On a Pilgrimage to God. Chapter 8. God Alone Suffices. Chapter 9. Incessant Prayer. Chapter 10. The Call into the Desert. Chapter 11. The Ridge Walk. Chapter 12. Who are you, O Lord? Chapter 13. To the Promised Land. Chapter 14. Recognizing the Will of God. Part 2. In the Promised Land. Chapter 15. On Hold. Chapter 16. House of the Knowledge of God. Chapter 17. With the Blessings of the Church. Chapter 18. Meeting Mother Teresa. Chapter 19. In the World of Vedanta. Chapter 20. Satchidananda Community. Chapter 21. Life between Christ and Krishna. Chapter 22. Christ in Indian Garb. Chapter 23. Monastic Perspectives. Chapter 24. On the Threshold of a New Horizon. Chapter 25. Dialogue between Religions. Part 3. The Path of the Masters. Chapter 26. On the Threshold. Chapter 27. Taking Hurdles. Chapter 28. The Master in the Light of the Gospel. Chapter 29. It Had Been His Gaze. Chapter 30. Towards Initiation. Chapter 31. Looking Back. Chapter 32. Sidelights on Dara. Chapter 33. Surat Shabd Yoga. Chapter 34. God and Creation. Chapter 35. The Souls in the Creation. Chapter 36. The Path of Salvation. Chapter 37. Return to Germany. Part 4. Living Santmat. Chapter 38. A New Beginning. Chapter 39. Monastery or World? Chapter 40. A Spiritual Life in the Middle of the World. Chapter 41. Setting Out Towards Reality. Chapter 42. The Living Master. Chapter 43. The Universal Christ. Chapter 44. The Mystic Dimension of Jesus Christ's Teaching. Chapter 45. The Mystic Dimension of the Christian Feasts. Chapter 46. On the Path of the Masters. Chapter 47. As the Years Pass By. Chapter 48. Completing Life. Preface. Adventure of Faith tells the life story of a person who was certain, from her very youth, that her priority was God, and who consciously chose a life of celibacy and devotion to support her priority. The book presents the reader with a gripping account of the author's many steps in her life's adventure as, driven by her faith, and an unflinching commitment to experience for herself its deepest meaning, she watched her life unfold. The reader travels with the author from her early childhood days in pre-war Germany to her life as a Benedictine Catholic nun, living the secluded discipline of life in a convent. We accompany her through her years spent as a Christian nun in a Hindu ashram in central India, to her discovery of the inner path of Surat Shabd Yoga, and the need for a spiritual master to guide her in inner practice, so she could learn from him to experience God within herself. From India, we return with the author to her land of birth as she comes back to Germany at her master's request. She then leaves her religious order and is called upon for the first time as an adult to live her life in the maelstrom of normal worldly activity, while retaining her priority of daily spiritual practice. As the author reflects on the many challenges she faced on the way, we witness her ever-widening perspectives and growing understanding of the relationship between the multiplicity of outward-focused religion and the oneness of the inner world of spirit. With our protagonist, we are confronted with the contradictions presented by the many religions in the name of one God. Equally, we share with her the resolution of these contradictions as, through her association with her Master, her Christian faith comes full circle at a deeper level, and she experiences the universal Christ and the Word incarnate in a profound and inner way. Spiritual reality cannot be described in words. This is the lesson of all teachers of spirit. What truth is at this most subtle of levels can only be hinted at, suggested, or at most, indicated. Even in normal life, it is an experience shared by most of us that the same words are understood differently by different people, for our interpretation of meaning is necessarily conditioned by our individual experience. Even the grammar and structure of different languages, being intimately connected with the cultures they express, indicate through their variations the multiple perspectives of humankind. Adventure of Faith is one person's perspective of her lifelong quest for God, expressed within the context of her particular background and Christian culture, and her personal experience of the teachings of the Masters. As the author delves deeply into the issues of theology, philosophy, prayer, and meditation with which she has had to grapple, she explores the universal behind the bewildering variety of religious doctrines, teachings, and meditative practices, making the book most relevant to seekers of that truth which transcends differences and unites, rather than divides. The book was translated from the original German by the author herself. Some of the quotations she included are from memory or from personal notes made during her lifelong search for the divine, rendered, summarized, or extracted from the source. This story is thrilling not only as the extraordinary travels and personal reflections of a seeker of the divine, but as the inner journey from the particular to the universal. For a sense of the ultimate destination of the adventure presented by this book, we may do no better than to refer to the inspiring words quoted by the author. I have learned so much from God that I can no longer call myself a Christian, a Hindu, a Muslim, a Buddhist, a Jew. The truth has shared so much of itself with me that I can no longer call myself a man, a woman, an angel, or even pure soul. Love has befriended Hafiz so completely, it has turned to ash and freed me of every concept and image my mind has ever known. J.C. Sethi, Secretary. Radha Swami Satsang Beas, February 2009. Introduction. God always remains an adventure, whose outcome we do not know. This experience, voiced by the contemporary Hungarian theologian and writer Ladislas Boros, runs through my life like a brightly colored thread. That is why I have called this book Adventure of Faith, for the term describes my own spiritual journey. In my early youth, I heard the call of God, and through that inner experience, God became my fate. That experience completely changed the course of my life. Since that moment, my goal has been to encounter Him, the one who called me by name and demanded my undivided heart. In the following years, I realized more and more that it is truly an adventure to get involved with God and surrender your life unconditionally to Him, because you do not know what He will make of it. It is indeed an adventure to step onto the path of abandonment to God, since the way ahead cannot be seen. Only in looking back at the part of the path already traveled does one recognize it as a path. If I had known in advance the countless twists and turns and the steep ridges awaiting me, I would never have had the courage to step on it. Yet the longer I followed this path, the clearer it became to me that there was no turning back. Outwardly, my way led at first into the Garden Inclosed of a Benedictine abbey, and 16 years later into the Promised Land of India. Footnote: a garden enclosed is my sister, my spouse, a spring shut up, a fountain sealed. Song of Solomon, chapter 4, verse 12. End footnote. Metaphorically speaking, this way took me through deserts and over oceans and high mountain passes until it ended at the feet of a living, true master. In an awe-inspiring moment, I recognized him as the inner guide whom I had been following for so many years, but on reaching this point, I realized that this was not the end of my journey. On the contrary, it proved to be the case that my life thus far had been only a phase of development and transformation, preparing me to meet my master and to step over the threshold to a new dimension of my spiritual life. This story, which I have written down at the request of my master, Maharaj Charan Singh of Beas, is a personal one. But I see it as a metaphor for the endeavor of everyone who is sincerely seeking God, true happiness, and inner peace. I also believe that my personal experience has much in common with the experience of anyone who is in search of answers to the fundamental human questions. What is the meaning of our life? Where do we come from? Where are we going? Why are there suffering and death in the world? This book is addressed particularly to Christian readers. As a Christian, I would like to share with them the overwhelming experience of discovering the mystic dimension of the Christian religion in the light of the teachings of the Masters, the mystery of the universal Christ, and the mystic dimension of the teachings of the Master of Nazareth and of the great Christian feasts. For me, this has been an awesome and profoundly happy revelation. Beyond that, the path of the Masters provided me with the means not just to deepen my intellectual knowledge of these mysteries, but to make practical progress in coming closer to the fulfillment of the highest aspirations of the Christian faith. Yet regardless of which religion one belongs to, and regardless of one's philosophical or cultural background, this book may help one to realize why people start to search for the unnameable and unfathomable. It is because we are spiritual beings dressed in a human body. We have unlimited spiritual potential within ourselves. When we understand this, we consider it to be our highest task as human beings to tread the spiritual path, to free ourselves from existential ignorance about our true nature. Only then will our soul be able to proceed towards her origin, the primal source of all that exists. The path of the Masters equips seekers of the truth with the method needed to spiritualize their life, to attain true self-knowledge, and finally to experience the ultimate reality. Realizing the potential of the path of the Masters was a fascinating experience for me, and sharing my experience with others was an important reason for writing this book. This book is an account of how I, a devout Christian and a Catholic nun, found the path of the Masters. The book gives a short survey of the teachings of the Masters and touches also upon how I have tried to live these teachings in my day-to-day life. Although I learned the way from a contemporary Indian master, that same way can be discovered in any religion. Most importantly, through my association with my master, I discovered the mystic way within my own religion, Christianity. My adventure of faith has not yet come to an end. It has only entered a new phase. The future is still unknown and the path is still steep, and as the years pass, I find that it requires much perseverance, determination, and an unflinching faith and confidence in the one whose call I heard so many years ago. I have no wish to hide these difficulties from the readers of this book. At the same time, I want to share with them my experience, that perseverance on the path of the Masters confers a deep inner peace and an unfading joy that fills me with profound gratitude. The path requires daily meditation, constant vigilance, and an untiring search for the Lord, and this cannot be done without a conscious yes to His will, as it manifests itself in all the circumstances of our daily life. Writing this book has been a wonderful experience for me, as I have watched my adventure of faith running once again like a movie before my eyes. I have become conscious anew of the divine guidance in my life. In looking back at the various phases of this way, and in reflecting about so many events and experiences on it, I was able to see patterns that I had not seen before. Although the thought of making the experiences of my adventure of faith accessible to a larger circle had caused a feeling of uneasiness in me, in the course of time my main feeling was one of joy at making my way once again in the company of future readers. That is why I express my hope that this book may provide a captivating read, as well as inspire and encourage readers to pursue their own adventure in search of God. Finally, I would like to convey my thanks to all who have followed the development of the book with interest and encouragement over the years, and who have cooperated in a marvelous way. I especially want to thank the Sangat of Munich, who have contributed much to the success of the book by their valuable advice and active support. Now I put this book at the feet of the present master, our beloved Baba Gurinder Singh, whose guiding hand and encouraging words have enabled me to write and to complete it. Shraddha Leertz, Munich, 7th February 2009. Part 1. Called by Name. Chapter 1. When God Becomes Fate. It was the spring of 1937. The train carrying the young girl home from school was just approaching the station. She was already standing in the open doorway of the carriage, ready to get off as soon as the train came to a halt. She might have been thinking about that morning's lessons, or about her homework for the afternoon. Maybe she was also thinking about the young boy from the grammar school who came to school every day on the same train and to whom her teenage heart had warmed. The one thing she certainly was not thinking about at that moment was God. Suddenly she felt as if an invisible light, coming from above, was flowing over her. She was spellbound, completely overwhelmed by what was happening. At the same time, she heard a clear and distinct voice inside saying, "Preserve your heart's capacity to love, for you know not whether God will one day ask you for your undivided heart." This experience was the beginning of my adventure of faith, which is the story of this book. It lasted no more than a few seconds. I did not have the slightest doubt that it was God who had spoken to me. His voice had been insistent, and at the same time infinitely gentle and full of love. It seemed very clear that I was entirely free to decide, but at the same time there was no doubt in my mind that I had to submit. The demand was inescapable, yet the decision was left to me. A deep feeling of happiness and inner peace filled me, and this made me sure that it was indeed the voice of God which I had heard. I was just 13.5 years old. Nothing like this had happened to me before, and I had no idea how it was going to affect my life. Yet I obeyed unquestioningly, immediately renouncing my feelings for the boy, without giving any thought to how God would one day claim my undivided heart. This experience of light and of the voice that came with it caused a complete about-turn in my life. Although I was unaware of it at the time, it redirected my life towards the transcendent, the absolute. It carried within itself a potential for spiritual growth that was to unfold progressively over the course of my later life. The divine sower had planted the seed of spirituality in my heart, and he would make sure that it would sprout and grow. God was no longer an anonymous being. He had spoken to me directly and unmistakably. He had called me by name, as the prophet Isaiah says, "I have called thee by thy name, thou art mine." He had laid his hand upon me and had thus become my personal God, to whom I surrendered my life unquestioningly and unconditionally, not knowing what the consequences would be. As Ignatius of Loyola said, speaking of his own experience, "Nobody knows what God will make of a man if he responds to his grace." It was clear to me that I could not talk to anyone about this experience. Seeing light and hearing a voice, nobody would believe me, or, even worse, people might call it the hysterical exaggerations of an adolescent. Our parents were devout Catholics and had educated us in the ways of the religious life. At home, we said our morning and evening prayers together, and there was a Thanksgiving prayer before and after each meal. Together with our parents, we attended church on Sundays and religious holidays. However, that day's experience would hardly fit into their religious framework. I did not speak to them about it, and there was no other confidant with whom I could have shared my story. In any case, I did not really feel the need to do so. The experience had changed my innermost being. I locked it away in my heart and kept it there as a precious treasure. This first encounter with God was a key moment in my life, for now God had put me on a road where there was no turning back. It was my first point of no return. This theme was to come up again and again in the course of my later life. Many times I was to be reminded that my unconditional surrender meant that there was to be no turning back. He had become my fate, and from then on, my life was inseparably connected with him. From the very beginning, I felt that my spiritual life was an adventure of faith. In his book, To Experience God in Life, Ladislas Boros says, "God always remains an adventure whose outcome we do not know." In spite of all the faith in God that I have gained in the course of the years, it is still an adventure to live in accord with the conviction that it is God who is so often responsible for the turning points in my life. Time and again there have been twists and turns that were caused not by external circumstances, but by inner impulses. During the course of my life, it has become ever clearer that submission to God is an adventure that means total insecurity, but, paradoxically, provides absolute security at the same time. With the twofold experience of light and voice, God had entered into my life in His own inscrutable manner. When He wishes to encounter a person, and the mystics assure us that His longing to unite an individual soul with Himself is infinitely greater than our longing can ever be, He is free to choose any means by which to catch our attention. He may move our hearts by joyful events or painful experiences, by words of the Holy Scriptures or human words. He may give us a flash of insight into divine truth and reality in order to evoke in us a deep yearning for God, or He may send us the experience of His divine light or divine voice. God's call can come to a person in so many ways. What counts is not the way in which the call comes to us, but the way we answer that call. Growing up to be a Christian. At the time of my first encounter with God, my family's material living conditions were severely shaken by the political situation in Germany, where Adolf Hitler and his National Socialist Party had come to power. Since my parents were devout Catholics, and as such were strongly opposed to the Nazi regime, they had to endure extreme economic hardship. We often had hardly enough to live on. There were 6 of us children at the time, and had to depend on the help of friends and various other benefactors. But my parents could not be shaken in their religious convictions, and even the reprisals of the local party leaders could not intimidate them. There were 2 fundamental attitudes that shaped my parents' lives: an unshakable faith in God and submission to His will, which they recognized even in the inescapable and fateful circumstances they were going through. Their faith and confidence in God was often severely tested, but the fact that they had to endure all these trials and troubles, chiefly on account of their religious convictions, only served to strengthen them in their faith. It gave them the courage to take as their main guide in life Christ's injunction in the Sermon on the Mount. But seek ye first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. Never once did I hear a word of complaint from them about the trials that were sent to them. As the eldest child, they let me share their worries, but by watching them, I also learned how to live by faith. In the small town where we lived, the pressure of the Nazis was suffocating, but in 1938, my parents managed to escape. They moved to Munich, my mother's hometown, hoping thus to be able to live in peace and to educate their children in the anonymity of a big city. Soon after our arrival, I came into contact with a Catholic youth organization, the Heiland, Old German for Heiland, Savior. Together with my girlfriends, I spent many hours reflecting upon our life as young Christians. We worshipped together and passed many joyful days on excursions into the mountains. Belonging to this group was important for all of us, for in this way we learned to integrate religion into our daily life, and practicing our religion was always a source of joy for us. In those years, I also started to seek pastoral advice about my quest to come closer to God. Although my discussions with various priests were very important to me, it was the books I read that influenced my religious development more than anything else, for I found books that contained invaluable guidance for my quest. Even so, I always knew deep in my heart that my soul's real guide was inside. I felt this anew every day. It was just as Teresa of Avila said in her autobiography. She wrote, "Since I did not have a spiritual guide, I read the books mentioned, hoping slowly to understand some of their contents. But soon I was forced to realize that I could not learn much from books unless the Lord Himself would teach me, for I hardly understood anything until the moment that His Majesty taught me by experience. Many times I found that I had only to submit to tender but irresistible inner impulses in order to feel the nearness of God. I experienced these impulses not just during prayer, but also at other times during the day. By submitting to them, I learned to trust my inner guide implicitly. It was he who taught me how to pray. At first, I prayed with familiar set phrases, then later with my own words, and eventually with just one word, which was enough to bring me into the presence of God, invisible and yet so near. By this last form of prayer, I was able to remain in his presence and to behold him. In hindsight, it seemed to me this youthful experience was like that of Johannes Marie Vianney, the holy pastor of Ars. He used to sit silent and motionless in his church. When asked what he was doing, he replied, "He beholds me, and I behold him." Jesus Christ in the center. In the years that followed our move to Munich, my spiritual life took a new turn. My devotion became Christ-centric, that is, Jesus Christ more and more became the center of my life. Increasingly, my search and my prayers were directed towards Jesus rather than towards God as before. Until now, I had not made any connection between Christ and my experience of the inner light and the inner voice. The voice had explicitly spoken of God, for whom I should preserve my heart. God meant our Father in heaven, to whom we addressed our prayers and in whom we placed our confidence. Of course, from my early childhood, Jesus was familiar to me as our beloved Savior, the one whom my parents received into their hearts at Holy Communion. My mother had explained this to me when I was a child of 3. As an adolescent, I found that receiving this sacred bread created a close and intimate bond between Jesus and my soul, a bond that grew ever more intense. Inwardly, I focused more and more on him, and I developed a very personal relationship with him. I had a fervent desire to go to Mass every day and to merge my heart with Jesus through Holy Communion. I loved to enter a church during the day in order to be with him, for my faith told me that he was present there in the form of the consecrated wafer. My love belonged to the incarnate Son of God, who became more and more familiar to me through readings from the Gospel during the celebration of Mass. The next step on my spiritual path came when I read the autobiography of Thérèse of Lisieux, The Story of a Soul, given to me by a priest. I found it completely fascinating, and I read it so often that in the end I practically knew it by heart. Maybe it was under the influence of this book that I first considered joining a convent so that I could dedicate my life completely to God and to Christ. When I talked to my parents about my wish, they were quite understanding, because both of them had had this desire in their youth. At that time, however, they considered me too young to put my wish into practice. Not wanting to put off dedicating my life to God till I was able to enter a convent, I asked my spiritual advisor for permission to take a private vow of celibacy, as I knew that young people quite often did this at that time in order to preserve their heart's undivided love for God. Such a choice can be traced back to the early days of Christianity, when the Christian community of Corinth asked St. Paul for his advice on this subject. He dealt with the question extensively, answering as follows: "But I would have you without carefulness, free from anxiety. He that is unmarried careth for the things that belong to the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But he that is married careth for the things that are of the world, how he may please his wife. There is difference also between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman careth for the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and in spirit. But she that is married careth for the things of the world, how she may please her husband. And this I speak for your own profit, that ye may attend upon the Lord without distraction." I was granted permission to take the vow of celibacy, and on taking this vow, I felt even more intimately connected with Christ. By now, I was 18, had finished my professional training, and was working as a secretary in an office. Chapter 2. Living in the Face of Death. 1 year after our move to Munich, the Second World War began, and my father, being a reserve officer from the First World War, was called up at the age of 52 to serve in the army. After a few months of training, he was sent to Russia, much of which was then occupied by the German army, and at the end of 1941, while in service, he contracted a severe disease and subsequently died after a few days in a field hospital. The death of her husband and the father of her 7 children, the youngest of whom was then only 4.5, was such a deep shock to my mother that for several months we feared for her life. On his last leave, my father had asked me to stand in for him during his absence. Now I had to actually replace him to a certain extent. I stood, as it were, as a partner at my mother's side, and together we overcame all our grief and sorrow and the events of the war, which became ever more threatening, with that unshakable faith that had been our anchor in times of need for so many years. Munich was being bombed by the British and American air forces, and the terror of the bombing taught us to live in the face of death. During one especially heavy air raid, we were all cowering in the basement while the house was shaken to its foundations. We had no hope of escaping alive from the inferno. In this extreme situation, I felt that our only safety lay in anticipating death, as it were. Inwardly, I hid myself in the bosom of God, convinced that I would have to appear before Him at any moment. Faced with certain death, I remained silently in the safety of His protection. But we were all spared, and even our house in the city center was hardly damaged at all, although all around many bombs had fallen, causing great devastation. Many churches that I used to visit had been reduced to ruins. For me, they had been a spiritual refuge, for there I had felt the nearness of God in a special way. They were places of recollection and prayer, and the services I had attended there were almost like participating in the mysteries of God that were celebrated in the liturgy. And so the destruction of these churches hit me harder than anything else, because it deprived me of the places where I could be with God. It was many months before I could pass by some of these ruins without shedding bitter tears at the thought that their smoke-stained walls were all that was left of them. As a reminder of how to cope with the horrors of war, I had pinned to the wall of my room a poem by Reinhold Schneider. Only by praying can we divert the sword over our heads and wrest the world free from the forces of justice by living a life in holiness. The war, with all its horrors, fears, and sorrows, with all its death and destruction, had swept over us like an apocalyptic judgment. In his poem, Reinhold Schneider speaks of the forces of justice. But who were those who by their excess of sins had brought this immeasurable suffering upon us? We ourselves pleaded not guilty. We felt that we were innocent victims, and we prayed to God that He might spare us. But were we really so innocent? After the war, there was much talk about the collective guilt of the German people. We could find no answer to the question of how God's love and justice could be reconciled with all we had gone through. However, we found solace and peace of mind in submission to the inscrutable will of God. Taking refuge in God, we tried to put Reinhold Schneider's words into practice and to lead a life in holiness, following Christ's directive to seek first His kingdom, and all else would follow naturally. The origin of suffering and death in the world, and the fact that all too often the seemingly guiltless are punished, is one of the most pressing questions facing humanity. It was only later in life, when I found the teachings of the Masters, that I was able to find some answers that satisfied both my head and my heart. Chapter 3. In Search of the Way. The idea of joining a convent had remained alive in my mind throughout the war, and I was determined that one day I would make it a reality. In fact, I thought of nothing else. The experiences of the war and my father's death had left on my mind an indelible impression of the transitory nature of all things. I now wanted to enter a strict cloister, a place where I could lead a life detached from the world, without being involved in teaching, nursing, or other such charitable works. My only desire was to dedicate myself to a life of prayer and contemplation. The story of a soul, mentioned before, had awakened my enthusiasm for the Carmelite order, and I wanted to become a Carmelite nun. But a visit to a Carmelite nunnery made it clear that this was not the place for me. Although the meeting with the prioress went quite well, I was frightened by the metal grille in the parlor, decorated with iron spikes, and the curtain that concealed her from me. I was so afraid that after a few hours I took flight and ran down the hill in order to get away as fast as I could. In this way, external considerations made me give up in just a few moments an ideal that I had been carrying in my mind for so long and with such great enthusiasm. This experience had at least taught me something about what was not my way. Next, I turned to the Benedictine order, with which I had felt a special bond ever since my youth. In recent years, I had spent a number of Easter holidays with a group of young people in the Neresheim Abbey in the Swabian Alps. Together with the monks, we had celebrated the liturgy and participated in the communal prayer. The Benedictine way of living was entirely dedicated to what the founder, Saint Benedict, had called the Opus Dei, the work of God. By this, he meant singing psalms and celebrating the liturgy. All this now filled my heart, so I looked for a Benedictine convent where I could seek admission. However, my first contact with a Benedictine abbey proved a disappointment. The nuns were unwilling to accept me as a choir sister because my schooling did not meet the standards applied to members of that community. I could have joined as a lay sister, but I could not agree to this, since lay sisters at that time were not allowed to participate actively in the liturgy and the communal prayer. A second attempt with another abbey was equally unsuccessful for the same reasons. This search for a place where I could take the veil was my first attempt to find out what God wanted me to do. Until now, it had only been a question of how to fulfill His will, for I had not had any difficulty understanding what His will was when it had manifested itself in that call from within the light. Now, however, and in times to come, I had to try to discover His will, for it was not always shown to me in a clear and obvious way. Meanwhile, the war had ended, and in order to escape office work, I began a course of professional training to become a social worker. The financial situation of our family meant that I needed to earn money for several more years before I could think of joining a convent. As part of my practical training, I had to spend some months in a placement in the town of Fulda. Before I went there, an old friend asked me to wait for him to finish his studies, because he wanted to marry me. I declined his proposal, saying that God had beaten him to it. He was quite disappointed and jealous, and he wanted to know what Christ meant to me. But how was I to explain this to someone whose aspirations were diametrically opposed to mine? By now, Christ had become the very foundation of my life, and my love for Him filled my whole heart. There were other young men who saw in me their future companion, but I turned down all their proposals. I was determined to dedicate my life exclusively to Christ by living as a nun and belonging only to Him. Images of Christ. During my stay in Fulda, I went every day to the church of the Benedictine Abbey to participate in the convent service. The apse of the church was covered with a more than life-size mosaic depicting Christ as Pantocrator, Christ in majesty. I was strongly attracted to this image, and I became so much absorbed in it that it stood before me throughout the day. This was a novel experience for me. I was doing a kind of pictorial meditation, which had been known to Christianity for as long as there had been pictures of Christ. In the course of the Christian meditation movement that began in the 1970s, pictorial meditation became an important part of object meditation, meditating on a particular object, such as a burning candle or a picture of Christ or of some saint. During my stay at Fulda, I experienced for myself the value of this form of meditation. The faithful contemplation of Christ's image touches the heart and moves it to love Him. Just as the love for a human being must be cherished to be kept alive, so also must the love of God be cultivated if it is not to wither. There is no doubt that this pictorial meditation keeps love alive if the contemplator turns to Christ within, with an open heart. After returning to Munich, I could no longer renew this contemplation every day, and this particular image of Christ slowly faded away, only to be replaced by another one. It was a picture of Veronica's veil that I had in my room and loved to look at. This picture has a special meaning for many pious Christians. Legend has it that on his way to crucifixion, Jesus left an imprint of his face on a piece of cloth given to him by Veronica, a name that means true picture in Latin, to wipe his sweaty, blood-stained face. This inspired lovers of Christ to pray to him to impress his face into their hearts, as described in the words of one unknown writer. We, who are all Christians, carry Veronica's veil in our heart, the veil imprinted with the divine face. Whatever we do or don't do should stand before this imprint. And not only this, we should all carry something of this imprint in ourselves and radiate it around us. This phase of contemplating on images of Christ continued for several years, and even after I became a nun, I loved to mark the books for our communal prayer with such pictures. Chapter 4. Leaving the World. In the spring of 1949, my best friend joined the Benedictine Abbey of St. Ehrentraud at Kellenried, near Ravensburg in Baden-Württemberg. She invited me to visit her there and look around. Was this the place to which God was calling me? I went there in order to find out. My friend spoke with great enthusiasm about the monastic life. 3 other young women had entered with her, joining a number of novices already there. At that time, the community numbered 70 members. I was able to meet the mistress of novices and to tell her why I wanted to become a nun. First and foremost was my wish to dedicate my life unconditionally to God. I was, as I have said before, particularly attracted to the order of St. Benedict, to their solemn chanting of the Psalms and the liturgy. The abbey, with its lofty buildings and Baroque church towers, seemed to me like a city on the mountain, where one is a little closer to heaven. After a few days, I applied for admission to this cloister, which was granted. Convinced that God had led me to this place, I planned to enter St. Ehrentraud in the autumn. When in September 1949 it was time for me to say goodbye to my former life, I did not find it easy to leave my home and everything that had been my life up to then. I had wished with all my heart to become a nun, and there had been ample time to weigh my decision and to prepare myself for this step. Yet my heart felt heavy now. Leaving my mother was especially difficult, and it was also hard for her to let me go. We had suffered and survived together through the horrors of the war years, through the pain of my father's death, and all the difficulties of the post-war period. This had created a very intimate bond between us, but my mother would never have come in the way of my vocation. I was her firstborn, and from the moment of my birth she had prayed that her little daughter might become a true child of God. When I dedicated my life to God, she saw her prayer fulfilled. And so, on the day that my long-cherished wish to take the veil was to be fulfilled, I was not in a joyous mood. Rather, it was a feeling of dying that took hold of me, and, of course, a feeling of profound uncertainty about what this new phase in my life would bring. There it was again, the adventure of faith that had begun when I first submitted to God's claim on my undivided heart. Giving up myself. Strangely enough, before entering the monastery, I had never reflected on the possibility that my life would thereby undergo a fundamental change. For many years now, I had wanted most ardently to be free for God. In leaving the world and leading a life of prayer and contemplation, I hoped that God would more and more take possession of my thinking and feeling, of my whole heart. I had never imagined that being free for God would mean the giving up of myself, yet that was exactly what I had to do in order to submit to Him. I felt that in order to be free for God, I had to leave the world, as hundreds and thousands of Christian men and women, as well as followers of other religions, had done before me. What I had completely overlooked was the fact that simply stepping over the threshold of the monastery would not automatically make me free for God. Outwardly, I would be leaving the world, but inwardly, I would still be carrying it with me. It is the human mind that carries the world within itself, because like a computer, it stores all the impressions supplied to it by the senses. In addition to that, it ceaselessly seeks new impressions, and it hankers insatiably for the satisfaction of all the desires that the senses awaken in it. It is, in truth, the most formidable obstacle to surrendering our life to God. These tendencies of the mind suffocate what St. Augustine, 354-430, refers to in the first chapter of his Confessions as a human being's restlessness for God. Therefore, if somebody really wishes to belong to God, he has to conquer the mind. Time and again, lovers of God have striven to control their minds through renunciation, self-abnegation, asceticism, and mortification. The monastic life, especially fulfilling the vows, has long been considered a suitable means of gaining control over the mind and making the seekers of God free for Him. The vow of poverty, having no personal possessions, should make the heart empty for God, and by obedience they should renounce their own self-centered will and live according to the will of God, as manifested in the commands of the abbot. Voluntary celibacy for the sake of love for God should preserve their hearts undivided for the Lord. The crucial question, however, is whether or not asceticism and self-abnegation can bring about detachment from the world and bestow upon the practitioner complete mastery of the mind and the senses. Can it truly make him free for God? In practice, it can at best purify the mind. Human endeavor alone will always remain imperfect. Real detachment from the world will be accomplished only through the experience of its nothingness, and only an irresistible pull from the divine will create a real freedom for God. At the time of my leaving the world and entering the Abbey of St. Ehrentraud, I was far away from entertaining such thoughts and having such insights. Chapter 5. The Garden Inclosed. When I entered the bounds of the Abbey of St. Ehrentraud in Kellenried, I was embraced by the Mother Abbess, and my friend gave me an impetuous hug. Then I was led into the church, where I knelt down and said to God, "Here I am." As the big front door closed behind me, a new world opened before me, a world to which I had to now adapt and in which I had to grow. From now on, this new world would shape my thinking and determine my actions. It would transform me in the spirit of Saint Benedict and the 14th-century-old tradition of his order. New norms, new attitudes, and new values would from now on define my life. New dimensions of spirituality would open up before me, but for the time being I felt somewhat dizzied and overwhelmed by all the new impressions. The first thing I had to do was get acquainted with the monastic routine. Every day the aspirants and novices gathered round their mistress, the magistra, who would be with us for the next 5 years, preparing us for the final vows and introducing us to the way of life in the convent. Every day we would read together one of the 73 chapters of the Rule of Saint Benedict, the Regula, which he had compiled more than 1400 years ago. It commences with the words, "Listen, my son, and bend the ear of thy heart." This would be one of our foremost duties in the coming years of preparation, which would be followed by the final vows, setting the seal on a life of dedication to God, a life of listening and putting into practice whatever we heard. Daily life in the monastery is regulated in every detail from morning till evening. It is punctuated by communal prayer in the church, which is recited at fixed hours during the day, and by the celebration of the liturgy according to the rule. At 5 o'clock in the morning, the chanting of psalms started. In the 43rd rule, Saint Benedict says that nothing should take priority over this Opus Dei. In those days in our monasteries, the psalms were still chanted in Latin, and the liturgy was sung in Gregorian chant. This service to God, lasting for at least 5 hours each day, is considered by the monastic family to be its main task. The monks and nuns of the Order of Saint Benedict believe that they offer this prayer to God in the name of the Church and on behalf of all Christians. It is their conviction that by their prayer they can have some influence on the fate of the world and that it will bring blessings on humankind. This belief is supported by the Church's teaching of the community of saints, the mystical body of Christ, according to which every member of the Church participates in the spiritual merits and the prayers of all the other members, because through their affiliation to Christ, they are one body. As St. Paul writes, "Now ye are the body of Christ, and members in particular." I loved this chanting of the Psalms and did my best to make it my personal prayer, or at least to merge with its atmosphere. Over the years, the beautiful words of the Psalms became very familiar to me. In so many ways, they express what moves the heart of a seeker of God. Above all, there were the Psalms that expressed the longing to encounter God, to behold his face, such as, "Make thy face to shine upon thy servant." Another verse I often repeated during the day was, "My soul thirsteth for God, for the living God. When shall I come and appear before God?" In this way, the communal prayer became a source of nourishment for my own religious life, and its deeply moving words were my daily inspiration. Becoming a Benedictine nun. Adapting to the monastic way of life was not always easy for me. From my earliest youth, I had been accustomed to taking responsibility and making my own decisions. Now I exercised obedience, adopting other people's thinking and being one among many with my fellow sisters. Renouncing part of my individuality and identity was a daily struggle and certainly not an easy one. This fact most probably had not escaped the attention of my superiors. In any case, I had to remain an aspirant for nearly a whole year before receiving the monastic habit and being allowed to start the novitiate. Waiting for such a long time was extremely difficult, and I began to wonder whether doubts might have arisen in the minds of my superiors as to the earnestness of my resolve to dedicate my life to God. Life in the monastery thus became a part of a process of self-denial that was all the harder because it was a new experience for me. This struggle continued even after I took the final vows. It took me quite a while to realize what an essential part of spiritual life this struggle is. At the end of the novitiate, I was permitted to take the monastic vows for 3 years, as is customary in the Catholic orders. Saint Benedict demands unconditional obedience to the abbot, who takes the place of Christ in the monastery. Furthermore, he demands that one should promise to remain in the same monastery. This was a preventative measure, since in his time there were wandering monks who went from one monastery to another. Finally, there was the vow to lead a monastic life, including poverty and celibacy. By now, I had a better understanding of what I was committing myself to by taking the final vows, and I promised with all my heart to live accordingly. This was to be my way of dedicating my life to God. It would be my way of surrendering myself to Him. In spite of the difficulties I have mentioned, I felt like a fish in water. I felt fulfilled, and I had no doubt that I was where God wanted me to be. He had led me to this convent to make me His own. The convent was, for me, His garden enclosed. Bride of the Divine Word. After nearly 5 years of preparation, on 22nd July 1954, I was allowed to take the final vows and receive the consecration of virgins. It was indeed a day of great joy, and I had been longing for it for many years. The ceremony of the consecration of virgins is like a wedding celebration in which the nun is the bride who marries her beloved Lord. The rite put momentous words into my mouth, which I sang with fervor. He has imprinted his seal on my forehead so that I would not admit another lover. After receiving the wedding ring, I sang, "With his ring my Lord Jesus Christ has wedded me, and like a bride he has crowned me." These texts are taken from the legendary biography of St. Agnes, who died a martyr's death at the beginning of the 4th century. In the ceremony, I was first asked by the bishop, "Do you want to be blessed and consecrated and wedded to our Lord Jesus Christ, the Son of the Almighty?" My answer was, "Yes, I do." As beautiful and inspiring as the ceremony had been, I was quite conscious that it was merely symbolic in character. The wedding ring that the bishop had put on my finger and the veil that I carried were nothing more than outer signs of something that I still had to realize within myself, the union of my soul with God. Although this day had filled me with great happiness, the ceremony alone did not make me a true bride of Christ, for it was but the symbolic anticipation of something that cannot be created by words or ceremonies. The mystic union with God could be accomplished only in the depth of my soul, and only there could I experience it. The reality was that I still felt myself far removed from the experience of divine union. Moreover, though I was now a bride of Christ, I did not experience the romantic feelings sometimes associated with this status. I was far from the state of the bridal mystics of the Middle Ages, such as Bernard of Clairvaux, Gertrude of Helfta, and her fellow sisters Mechtilde of Magdeburg and Mechtilde of Hackeborn, Catherine of Siena, and many others. Those men and women took their inspiration mainly from the texts of the Song of Solomon, which probably dates from the second half of the 5th century BCE. They were filled with ardent love for Christ, and in their visions and ecstasies, they experienced what the often daring words of this song hinted at. The Bride. Thy love is better than wine. Because of the savor of thy good ointments, thy name is as ointment poured forth. Therefore do the virgins love thee. Draw me, we will run after thee. The king hath brought me into his chambers. The bridegroom. Rise up, my love, my fair one, and come away. Let me see thy countenance, let me hear thy voice, for sweet is thy voice, and thy countenance is comely. The bride. By night on my bed I sought him, whom my soul loveth. I sought him, but I found him not. I will rise now, and go about the city in the streets, and in the broad ways I will seek him, whom my soul loveth. I sought him, but I found him not. The watchmen that go about in the city found me, to whom I said, Saw ye him whom my soul loveth? It was but a little that I passed from them, but I found him whom my soul loveth. I held him and would not let him go, until I had brought him into my mother's house, and into the chamber of her that conceived me. The bridegroom. Thou hast ravished my heart, my sister, my spouse. Thou hast ravished my heart with one of thine eyes, with one chain of thy neck. How fair is thy love, my sister, my spouse! How much better is thy love than wine, and the smell of thine ointments than spices! A garden enclosed is my sister, my spouse, a spring shut up, a fountain sealed. The bride. I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine. Set me as a seal upon thine heart, as a seal upon thine arm. For love is strong as death, jealousy is cruel as the grave. The coals thereof are coals of fire, which hath a most vehement flame. Many waters cannot quench love, neither can the floods drown it. The mystics interpreted these verses exclusively in allegoric and symbolic terms, explaining their mystic meaning in various commentaries, of which one of the most famous was that of Bernard of Clairvaux. The nuns of Helfta composed songs overflowing with love for their bridegroom, which at that time moved the hearts of many people, including people outside the cloister. Here are two examples, composed by Mechthild of Magdeburg. I rejoice in loving him who loves me, and I desire to die of love, to love ceaselessly and boundlessly. Rejoice, my soul, because your life has died of love for you. Do love him so much that you could die for him. Thus you will burn forever unquenchably, as a living spark in the great fire of the exalted majesty. Then you will be replenished with the fire of love that nourishes and stills you already here. The soul to the mind. You can no longer teach me anything. I cannot turn away from love any more. I must give myself as a captive to it, because otherwise I cannot live any more. Where love is, there must I be, in life as well as in death. I wish to die of love, if this I could do, because him that I love I have seen with my enlightened eyes, standing in my soul. The bride who has sheltered her beloved need not go to distant places. Compared with these great mystics, my bridal state was quite sober. But even though I did not experience any high-flown feelings, being a bride of Christ was much more than just an intellectual matter. It was a source of deeply felt joy and happiness. Chapter 6. In the Sign of Fire. Taking the final vows and receiving the consecration of virgins was for me the culmination of many years of striving. I had always thought of this as my final goal, but in reality, it turned out to be just a milestone on my spiritual path. But I did not realize this until after the wedding ceremony. I would have liked so much to keep alive the exalted mood of that special day, but after a while those feelings faded away and the daily monastic routine took over, in which I had to prove my dedication to God hour by hour. The path ahead of me seemed to be well marked out. It would be straight and clear, passing for the most part across level ground, perhaps ascending here and there onto a plateau, but probably without any remarkable ups and downs. In the peace and remoteness of the monastery, I would try to come closer to God, till one day my life would merge into Him at the hour of my death. I would serve my monastic family and contribute to the earning of our livelihood, as the founder of our order demands from his disciples. The Opus Dei, participation in the liturgy, would constitute my main concern. Above all, however, there would be the ceaseless search for God. I wanted to grow into a deep spiritual life of prayer and contemplation. Such were my life expectations. What God would make of my life, which was no longer my own, I did not know. How could I foresee that it would one day take a completely different turn? Actually, there would be no smooth path ahead of me, no straight and well-trodden way. On the contrary, the road ahead would prove to be steep, with many twists and turns, truly an adventure. And this unforeseen path would demand a measure of obedience to God that even the strictest rule of any religious order could not require. For the time being, however, the course of my life was indeed even. I spent 5 to 6 hours of each day chanting psalms and celebrating the liturgy with my fellow sisters. Between the lauds, morning prayer, and Mass, there was a gap of about half an hour that was set aside for contemplation, for pious reflection on God, His attributes and His works, and on the mystery of Jesus Christ and His teachings. In the evenings, we had 20 minutes of free time for our personal prayers, for our own search for His countenance. 1 hour each day was allotted to the study of theological and religious books. 4 hours were given to working for our livelihood in the gardens, on the land, in housekeeping, or in the various handicraft and art studios. I worked in the orchards and learned everything about the cultivation of fruit trees and the harvesting and storing of fruit. In the winter, I took care of the pruning of the fruit trees and the berry bushes like a real expert. After it was discovered that I had an artistic vein, I was put to work in the embroidering studio for some years. I designed and made garments for use in the liturgy, as well as wall hangings and flags. Later, when somebody was needed to manage the flower garden, I was chosen for the job, as I was young, healthy, and strong. Since I knew nothing about growing flowers, books on horticulture piled up on my table, taking the place of theological works. I became responsible for decorating the church and making the cloister look nice with flowers, besides looking after the flower gardens and the greenhouse. I loved all those jobs and tried to learn all about them. In summer, we all worked on the land, helping to bring in the harvest. Twice a day, the community gathered for recreation. This was a time when we wandered through the fields, meadows, and woods within the monastery walls, or sat together doing some manual work. Those were happy times, and we all felt sure that the sun shone brighter within the walls of our monastery than it did in the world outside. 1 year after taking my final vows, however, I started to become restless. I was afraid that my life in the monastery would peter out or become stuck in mediocrity. For the first time, the idea of a more austere way of life came to my mind. I envisaged a life much more strictly and one-pointedly devoted to the search for God. This had happened to other seekers before me, including the great Christian teachers Thomas Merton, Charles de Foucault, and John of the Cross, who I was to learn of later. At first, I did not try to analyze this vague feeling of dissatisfaction. Maybe it was a reaction to the intensity of those earlier years when I was preparing for the final vows. Perhaps I was sometimes dissatisfied with the routine nature of my monastic life, for there was a lack of novelty, a lack of any striking new developments, but I could hardly have expected otherwise. The daily routine, designed to facilitate a life of prayer and devotion, possibly led in my case to a feeling of stagnation. I certainly did my best to live a more intense religious life. I tried to concentrate on God even during my work, to be more attentive and aware during the community prayer, and to come to a more intimate contact with God in my personal prayer. But I felt that all this did not advance me one bit in my desire to love God more. I felt a powerful urge to come closer to Him, or rather to immerse myself more deeply in Him, but I was at a loss as to how this could be done. It is exactly this wish to come closer to God, this longing to be with Him, that is the foundation of our spiritual life. This yearning is planted into our hearts by God, and we may rest assured that He Himself will fulfill it in His own way and in His own time. In my case, that time came during a week of recollection at the start of 1956. A single sentence brought about the turning point. During one of his sermons, the monk who led the spiritual exercises said, "We must have the courage to say to God, 'Do with me as you like.' You may be sure that God will respond." I gratefully took up this suggestion and prepared myself as well as I could to offer this prayer to God. It had to come from the depth of my heart. I wanted to put into it my whole desire to belong to God. After resolute preparation, I prayed to God using the words the monk had suggested, and opened my heart to His response. God's response came after just a few days. It fell upon me like fire, in just the same way that it had in my youth. Again, it lasted only for a fraction of a second, like a flash of lightning, and God had taken possession of me. At least I was convinced that it was He who had attracted the eyes of my soul to Him by this experience. It was no longer me longing to belong to Him. Now it was He who wanted to possess my undivided heart, as He had intimated all those years ago. I could not have brought about such an experience myself. This is something that only God can do, for only He has access to a person's innermost being. On a fragment of parchment sewn into his clothing and found after his death, Blaise Pascal describes an experience I very much related to. He writes, "On 23rd November, in the year of grace 1654, on the day of St. Clement, Pope and Martyr, which was also the day of other martyrs, on the eve of St. Chrysogonus, Martyr, and others, between 10:30 and 12:30, fire. God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, not the God of philosophers and scribes. Certainty, certainty, sentiment, joy, peace. Forgotten the world except God. The people do not know you at all, but I do know you. Joy, joy. I had separated myself from Him. Him who is the fountain of living water I had forsaken. My God, will you forsake me? May I not forever be separated from you." Once again, my contact with the transcendent, which was the driving force behind my adventure of faith, had been only momentary, but it was impossible to run away from it, for I was already far too involved with the one who had called me by name. My only choice was unconditional submission. After this experience, days, weeks, and months passed in silent submission to God. I found that it was impossible to divert my inner gaze from God. I was quite unable to turn away from the inner light that radiated imperceptibly from his hidden face. All I wanted was to respond to his gaze without words or thoughts. This experience put an end to my pictorial meditation, for I found that I no longer needed Christ's image to contemplate upon. Not only had it become superfluous, but it even, paradoxically, covered up the face of God. In a desert of ice. This blissful state, however, was not meant to last. After some time, I found myself in a conflict of conscience between my duty of monastic obedience and my irresistible inner urge to remain in silence before God. It was obligatory in our community to use a book for morning meditation to help us in thinking about the divine. I felt it my duty to obey this command. At the same time, however, I felt unable to do so, since his gaze arrested my inner attention. This conflict crushed me inwardly, since my superiors did not understand my wish for silent prayer and insisted that I use the book instead. Under this pressure, my heart slowly froze until in the end it felt dead, and I was caught up in a terrible desert of ice. God seemed to be very far away. Only a gloomy longing for him filled my heart. Many years later, I happened on an article that dealt with similar experiences. The author describes the attempt to resist the urge towards contemplative prayer as a suicide of the soul, and that is just what it felt like. I had been brought to the limits of my physical and mental strength. The radiant beginning ended in a catastrophe in which I all but drowned. The moments when my encounter with God flashed up again became increasingly rare. I wandered quite lost through the fearsome desert of ice, even though in my innermost heart I was sure that all the time God was embracing my life from all sides, and that he was imperceptibly ever present. This ice phase lasted a long time. It was a great help to me to read, among other books, L'abandon à la providence divine, Abandonment to Divine Providence. This book of letters of Père de Caussade of the Society of Jesus was one that I kept with me for many years. It helped me to learn a form of submission to God that I had not consciously practiced before. This form of submission means letting oneself be an instrument of God's will. Until now, it had always been I who had tried to fulfill his will. Now God would act upon me to fulfill his will. During this new phase, I learned that to practice "Thy will be done" by no means implies an attitude of passivity. On the contrary, it is a very intense and active process in which the will of a person embraces God's will with all his strength and makes it his own. How I had yearned to abandon myself to God! And yet how little had I known what this truly meant! I was now learning this lesson in a way that could not have been more painful, but was at the same time highly effective. The letters of Père de Caussade made a profound impression on me. Again and again I took up the book, soaking up the inspiring thoughts. A small paragraph reads like an entire program for spirituality, to which nothing needs to be added. He wrote, "The comprehensive and solid foundation of a spiritual life lies in giving up yourself to God, so that he might dispose of you in every respect. It means forgetting oneself to such an extent as to consider oneself as sold and delivered and as something to which one has forfeited all rights. As I began to implement this advice, my heart came back to life, and I gradually regained inner peace of mind. Chapter 7. On a Pilgrimage to God. The next 4 years of my monastic life passed in this state of peace. Among the various books that were then my spiritual companions, Père de Caussade's Abandonment to Divine Providence had become the most important guide of my spiritual life. His words of counsel and instruction revealed to me the secret of encountering God in one's daily life. The present moment is like an ambassador who transmits God's orders. The heart incessantly pronounces its fiat, "Let it be done." Then Père de Caussade explains how to be always close to God. He says, "Man's unconditional submission coaxes God into his innermost heart." In those years, I also received much spiritual nourishment from a theological work about the central mystery of Christianity, the mystery of Jesus Christ, by Matthias Schieben. I felt the need to penetrate deeper into the mystery of Christ, the Word incarnate, on account of which I had dedicated my life to God. It was many years now since Christ had become so close and intimate to me when I had contemplated the mosaic in the church of Fulda Abbey. Schieben's comprehensive work, which presents the doctrine of the Catholic Church concerning Jesus Christ, now helped me to create for myself an intellectual concept of the Son of God. I made a very thorough study, trying to grasp the various aspects of Christology. This I did mainly with my heart, because I wanted to be still more intimately connected with Christ. This book was my constant companion, especially during the preparation for the liturgical celebration of the birth of Christ, and in reading it I received much benefit for my spiritual life. Although the study of theological books can create a disposition in the human mind to turn to God, it can by no means transmit any experience of God. Although I found, as I said, that Schieben's book helped me to create my own intellectual concept of Jesus Christ, it should always be clear that the image such studies create is a mental one, a picture of God with human features. In order to come to true knowledge and a living experience of God, mystics and teachers of spirituality unanimously insist that, at least during contemplative prayer and meditation, one must leave behind any picture of God fabricated by the mind, or any image created by the hand, for that matter. Such advice is found in scriptures written as long ago as the 4th century CE by the fathers of monasticism, the fathers of the desert. Evagrius the Solitary, who died in the year CE 399, demands of his disciples, "You desire to see the face of the Father. Then under no circumstances search for a mental picture at the time of prayer." 900 years later, Meister Eckhart, 1260 to 1328, expressed it in a similar way. Man therefore should not satisfy himself with a thought of God, for when the thought disappears, God disappears as well. Rather, one should have an essential God, who stands far above the thinking of humanity and above all creation. But it is not only the contemplatives and mystics who have stressed the need to leave behind every concept or mental picture of God if one wishes to encounter him. Even such a brilliant thinker and theologian as St. Thomas Aquinas, author of the Summa Theologica, realized at the end of his life that nothing can be known, thought, or said about God, and he refused to complete the Summa. When asked for the reason, he replied, "I am no longer able to write, because everything that I have written appears like straw compared to what has been revealed to me now. His biographer reports that during the celebration of Mass, the saint was suddenly struck by something that moved him deeply and changed him completely. Celebrating feasts for the Lord. The monastic life, according to Saint Benedict, is shaped first of all by the rule, by the observance of which the seeker will speed up the way of the precepts of God in an unspeakable bliss of love, as he promises in the preface of his Regula. Secondly, it is marked by the daily celebration of the liturgy, the Opus Dei, or work of God, especially the great religious feasts of the ecclesiastical year, which are the high points of monastic life. Most of all, I loved Advent, the weeks of waiting for the coming of Christ. It was a time of preparation for the liturgical celebration of the birth of Jesus at Christmas. I found my own feelings perfectly expressed in the communal prayer, the psalms and the readings, hymns and prayers for the coming of the Savior, which we sang and recited every day. All those texts echoed my own yearnings. There was, for instance, the introit of the Mass where Jerusalem symbolizes the soul. Jerusalem, rise up and stand on a high place and see the joy that comes to you from your God. The words exhort us most urgently. Now is the time to wake up from sleep. And, the Lord comes! Hurry to meet him and make level his way. At the end of this time of preparation for the coming of Christ, we heard the words, so full of promise. Today you know that the Lord will come, and tomorrow you will behold his glory. Full of longing and expectancy, my fellow sisters and I awaited the advent of the Word of God, which, according to our faith, was to take place under the veil of the liturgical ceremony, and it was with great joy that we celebrated the memory of his birth on that holy night. I have to say, though, that despite all their splendor, these celebrations always left me with a certain feeling of disappointment. We had all enjoyed the festive mood, but had anything more significant actually happened? Had the Lord come secretly without anyone noticing it? Had the birth of the divine word occurred in me without any indication at all, even though I had prepared myself with all my heart? Why wasn't I aware of his coming? I was at a loss to answer these questions, but I relied on my faith, which told me that the outer celebration could and must effect within each of us the grace of the birth of Christ. Otherwise, everything would have been in vain. As Angelus Silesius says in his Cherubic Wanderer, were Christ to be born 1,000 times in Bethlehem, and not in you, you would be lost forever. We prepared for the feast of Easter with the same intensity as we did for the birth of Christ. At Easter, we celebrated Christ's victory over death, his resurrection, and the redemption of humanity through him. The weeks leading up to Easter were filled with more recollection, more prayer, more study of the divine truths, and even more turning towards God, to whom we had dedicated our lives. Easter Eve, as it was celebrated in the monastery, was a beautiful feast extending over many hours, with scriptural readings, chanting of psalms and hymns, and rites full of profound meaning. We were filled with gratitude and joy at Jesus Christ's victory over the powers of darkness and death. We always anticipated with a special joy the singing of the Exultet, Rejoice, a hymn for the consecration of the Easter candle, sounding as it did, almost ecstatic in its expression of boundless jubilation. It praised even the sins of humankind. O felix culpa, quae talem accitantum merit abere redemptorem. O happy sin that has deserved such an exalted Redeemer. As at Christmas, So too at Easter, the historical events in Christ's life were given prominence, because it was, according to the Christian faith, through the liturgical celebration of these events that the world would receive the divine grace of salvation, which Christ earned through his birth, death, and resurrection. But just how this grace would be bestowed on us, just how we would participate in it, and how it would affect us, all this remained a mystery of faith. At Easter, as at Christmas, a certain mental elation followed the liturgical ceremonies, but we had nothing tangible. After the Easter celebration, we were exactly the same human beings as before. Nothing had changed, at least nothing that we were aware of. As before, I had to rely on my faith in the reality of salvation after death. But isn't the path of salvation something real? Something we can experience? If the liberation from the slavery of the prince of this world and the return of the soul to the house of the Father cannot be experienced within us, can it be real? Footnote. Now is the judgment of this world. Now shall the prince of this world be cast out. John, chapter 12, verse 31. End footnote. With the third great feast of the ecclesiastical year, Pentecost, the feast of the Creator Spirit, who fills the whole world and knows every word that is said, we celebrated the descent of the Holy Spirit upon the apostles of Jesus Christ on the 50th day after his death and resurrection. Although the liturgical texts possess a compelling urgency, I had but little access to the mystery of this feast. Again, the liturgy aroused intense prayer in our hearts. Come, Holy Spirit, gift of the Most High, fountain of life, burning fire, love, sevenfold gift of God. But who is this Spirit of God, and how could I experience his coming? This again remained a mystery of faith. It wasn't until many years later, through the teachings of the Masters, that I received an answer to my questions concerning the mystery of these Christian feasts. During these years, I familiarized myself more with the Benedictine way of contemplation, as presented by a fellow brother in the Order of Saint Benedict, Father Vincentius Stabler. This path proved to be a complex system of observations and actions, putting the vows into practice, exercising the ora et labora, pray and work, and reciting the Opus Dei, which might lead one finally to the Oratio Pura, the pure prayer, as realized by Saint Benedict. This last stage is the contemplative, wordless prayer, God consciousness in the depth of the soul. During all those years of my monastic life, it was this inner awareness of God that I aspired to with all my heart. God had awoken this in me early in my youth and rekindled it again and again. Every once in a while, I was allowed to experience his presence for short moments, albeit in a very hidden way. Most of the time, however, my pilgrimage progressed in the darkness of faith. My companion on the way was my inner guide who had been with me for so long. It was he who taught me to turn to God again and again and to find repose in him. It was he in whom I put my trust in order to follow, according to the advice of Père de Caussade, the guidance of the Holy Spirit who is present in us all. Chapter 8. God alone suffices. With the passing of the years, life in the monastery had slowly and imperceptibly become routine. I fulfilled my monastic duties as a matter of habit, so that once again the routine nature of my life led me into what I experienced as a state of mediocrity. My spiritual life had lost its depth, and, without my being aware of it, I was lost in the fulfillment of my day-to-day duties. How long this lasted, I do not recall. In autumn 1961, however, without any visible cause, God made himself fall upon me like a judge, and in the light of God's incorruptible brightness, I saw myself as I really was. I was shown, more clearly than ever before, the countless defects of my character. Shocked and utterly dejected, I started to list all these defects, amounting to more than 50. The list no longer exists, but it can be easily reconstructed from the promises I made to God once I had recovered from the shock caused by this self-knowledge. There were no major shortcomings, just many little acts of spiritual negligence, creating a state of indifference that was lethal to true spirituality. There were so many little concessions in order to gratify the senses, so many moments spent with trivialities when I should have been turning my heart to God, moments meant for prayer. When such habits take root, they can become an insurmountable hindrance on the spiritual path. Above all, there was the neglect of those soft and gentle impulses of God's grace that had invited me to stay with Him, and that I had perceived only too well. This examination of my conscience was also inspired by a small booklet that Père Lalemant had written about the life of monks and nuns. In one chapter, he deals with the second conversion, describing life in monasteries. Recognizing myself in his exposition, I was deeply shaken. I did not want to suffer the fate of those who lost all perspective in their lives, who held back from dedicating themselves to God and rejoiced in the satisfaction of their selfish desires. In her autobiography, Teresa of Avila eloquently depicts this condition, which she herself had experienced. She describes her life in the cloister as drifting in an impetuous sea that lasted 20 years. She saw herself constantly falling, rising up, and again falling. She admits that worldly things, sensual pleasures, conversations, and 1,000 vanities had fettered her in spite of the practice of contemplative prayer. Often she asked the Lord to help her, but she had not put her full confidence in Him. She had searched for a remedy and made efforts to improve, but she had not realized that all this would be of little use unless she gave up completely her trust in herself and put all her trust in God. Teresa confesses that she lived in this condition as if in the shadow of death. She realized that God could not give her what she was longing for, and that He could not help her, because every time He led her back to Him, she left Him again. She describes her second conversion in her autobiography as follows. One day, when I went to the oratory, it so happened that my look fell on a picture. This picture showed Christ, covered with many injuries, and this awakened such devotion in me that I was very much taken aback to see the Savior maltreated like this, because it vividly expressed to me what He had suffered for us. When I considered the ingratitude with which I had repaid Him for these injuries, my grief was so great that my heart seemed to break. I threw myself down before Him, shedding streams of tears, and implored Him to give me strength so that I would not insult Him any more. In addition to this description, Teresa writes, I started now with a greater inclination to devote more time to keeping company with God, and I began to keep away from wayward opportunities, such as worldly friendships and chatting in the parlor. Then, as they were out of my sight, I returned immediately back to His Majesty. Once again, I had reached a milestone on my pilgrimage to God. I wrote down my resolutions in the form of a prayer, not to deny God a single wish, to dedicate my whole being to God unconditionally, and to be completely at His disposal. Realizing well my weakness and inconstancy, I prayed to God that I might at least live in the fear of once again losing the grace of conversion. I wanted to shun neglect, infidelity, forgetfulness, and everything that might displease God, while openly confessing all my faults. With a wakeful heart, I would live before His face and do nothing that might divert my gaze from Him. Over the prayer I had written, for daily contemplation, adding that God might help me to keep my promises and again take possession of my life. When I drew up this Magna Carta of my spiritual life, I was well aware of my shortcomings and weaknesses, but I thought that this, my second conversion and its practical implementation, would depend mainly on my own good will and determination, and on my own initiative and high-mindedness. Consequently, I fell into a kind of high-voltage mental state, a phenomenon well known to the fathers of monasticism in the early days of Christianity, who observed that when the bow is overstretched, it ends up breaking. Full of enthusiasm and eagerness, I began by modeling my life according to the resolutions I had made. In hindsight, I would see that my inner guide allowed me time to experience where my ambition for high-performance spirituality would lead me. I still had to learn another lesson that, as yet, I knew in theory, but not from personal experience, that everything is His grace. Some months after my conversion, I fell prey to a temptation that swept aside all my resolutions and everything that had begun so promisingly. Driven by ambition and blind eagerness to do something extraordinary, I threw myself into a task I would not normally have been able to cope with. It was the design and manufacture of a whole set of pontifical vestments, robes for the celebration of the ecclesiastical service in a Benedictine abbey. The execution of this project demanded an effort that absorbed all my time and energy for about a year and a half, and I was literally unable to think of anything else. I followed the communal prayers mechanically, and I practically gave up my personal prayer, so that the inner contact with God loosened more and more. The divine horizon in my life had vanished, and the world of faith hardly touched me any more, although I was practically surrounded by it. I lost myself in a desert of God-forsakenness, even though I was living, so to speak, under the same roof with Him. Well aware of my situation, I left things as they were because I felt powerless to change them. In the summer of 1962, the project was completed, and I found myself facing the ruins of my spiritual life. Filled with horror, I stared into the burnt-out place that once had been a God-loving heart. This was the end of my life with God. That much was clear to me. I was paralyzed and knew that a new beginning was impossible. I had neglected Him too much. Too often I had waved aside His invitations to stay with Him. At that time, I found myself incapable of a single thought that might bring me close to God again. I thought that from then on, I was 39 at the time, my monastic life would be a mere facade. Behind it, death, emptiness, and darkness would reign. This would indeed be hell. For several weeks I remained in this deadly emptiness, filled with an immense, mournful loneliness. My reckless ambition had destroyed everything that had developed in all those years since my first encounter with God. But I was not forsaken. The Lord saw my hopelessness and despair. Although I had strayed away from Him, He was as close to me as ever. I had to go to the very brink of the abyss in order to realize my utter inability to come to God by my own strength. Only then would I experience His mercy and grace. This desolate condition may have lasted 2 months. Wrapped in utter darkness, I sat in my meditation place, feeling as if I were dead. Suddenly the words, "Todo es nada, solo Dios basta." All is nothing, God alone suffices, came into my heart, perhaps reflecting something I had read by Saint Teresa. Footnote. The words are similar to a verse Teresa of Avila wrote in her breviary. Todo se pasa, solo Dios basta. End footnote. By these words I understood that other than God, all is nothing. At first it was just a remote echo resounding within me. Gratefully I took hold of it, convinced that it was God who had made it come alive in me. How could I have had such a thought myself when I was so far away from understanding its meaning? God alone suffices. These words dropped into my burnt-out heart like a tiny spark of light. I clasped them to me and repeated them incessantly. In the course of the days and weeks that followed, this tiny spark grew bigger and bigger until it became a bright flame and finally a blazing fire that took possession not only of my heart, but of my whole being. God had rescued me and restored me to a life with Him. God alone suffices. From now on, this would determine my life in the monastery. With great zeal, I set out to really put God in first place in my life. Of course, for a nun, this goes without saying. For me, however, it represented a huge decision. I used every minute for silent prayer and called upon my newly awakened spiritual strength for the encounter with God, who had once again become the center of my life. My life had been restored to me. Now I wanted to turn it into an incessant prayer, and I asked the Lord to teach me. God heard my prayer in a way that I could never have imagined. Thus began a new phase in my adventure of faith. Chapter 9. Incessant Prayer. This rebirth to a life of prayer took place in August 1962. Yet I still did not know how to turn my life into an incessant prayer. I made great efforts to think of God all day, but this quickly tired me. To direct all my thinking permanently towards God seemed impossible. As I wrote in my diary, sooner or later the mind gets weary of continuously thinking of God and capitulates. But love yearns to dwell with God, and one feels the desire to belong to Him. Looking for a solution, I found some books in our library on inner contemplative prayer, abandonment to divine providence, and also the letters of Abbot J.H. Chapman, mentioned earlier. They were of great help in understanding the mysteries of the relationship between God and the soul, which we call prayer. But I found nothing about incessant prayer. In a conversation with one of my fellow sisters, who, like me, was in search of inner, ceaseless prayer, she drew my attention to the Jesus prayer. She told me that it had opened up a new way of connecting with God and had taught her to pray incessantly. The classic book on the Jesus prayer is the Philokalia, meaning love for spiritual beauty. It is a collection of texts by more than 30 different authors of early Christianity, from the 4th to the 15th century CE. First published in Greek in 1782 in Venice, it was later translated into several other European languages. The volume I found in our library was a selection in German. The Philokalia immediately fascinated me. As I read it, my heart absorbed the words of those saintly and venerable writers, soaking them up page by page like a sponge. Then I began to practice the Jesus prayer, first using the classic formula. Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. The prayer of the blind man in the Gospel of Mark. The first days with the Jesus Prayer were blissful and encouraging. I felt its effect almost immediately. I was filled with a profound inner peace and an inclination towards good, which made me realize its inherent power. Soon, however, I noted that incessant prayer demands complete self-denial on the part of the practitioner, and that it would take immense efforts to concentrate my thinking on God by means of the Jesus Prayer. For the first time, I became aware of the vast number of futile and superfluous thoughts that occupied my mind all day. Now it was up to me to conquer them with the Jesus Prayer, or rather, not to allow them to surface. This needs wakefulness, or alertness of mind, to which the authors of the Philokalia attach great importance. Wakefulness is a term that is quite frequently found in their instructions. Hesychios of Sinai, for instance, writes, "In my opinion, the first step of wakefulness consists in the strict control of pictures of the imagination and the whisperings, for without exciting our imagination, the devil cannot influence our thinking. The second step is to try to always maintain one's heart in silence and to prepare it in deep calm and without any haste for the prayer. The humble and ceaseless prayer of Jesus I call the third step. A further step is the constant remembrance of death. Like good guardsmen, these exercises defend the soul against the entrance of all bad thoughts. From this point on, these fathers of monasticism became my great teachers, and I regularly turned to them for advice and help. Their first and foremost instruction was, be patient. Chase away the scattering thoughts from your mind. They also advised, teach your mind not to run outside. I also found inspiring words in the instructions of a contemporary teacher of the Jesus Prayer who wrote, this incessant prayer is like a filter through which our thoughts must pass. Only what is compatible with the holy name of Jesus is allowed to pass. Yet after a short time, it became evident that I was unable to identify with the classic formula of the Jesus Prayer. To express my love and devotion to Jesus, I had to formulate my own text. For some days, I experimented in order to find the words I wanted to say to God. Finally, a short sentence emerged centered around the name of Jesus, the inclusion of which is, according to the instructions, essential. Now that I had found my own prayer of the heart, I practiced it with great intensity within and sometimes spoke it out loud. The term, prayer of the heart, refers to the method by which the ceaseless Jesus prayer was practiced by the monks of early Christianity. For instance, the instructions of Gregory of Sinai read as follows. Sit with lowered head on a low stool. In this position, let your breath flow, as it were, into your heart and hold it there, and practice the prayer of Jesus without interruption. Much importance was attached to the breathing technique by the hesychasts, from the Greek hesychia, to be in peace, in calmness, for the practice of the Jesus Prayer. It served to bring the mind, the attention, back inside the body, and make the mind collect within itself in order to practice the Jesus Prayer in complete recollection. The teachers of the Jesus Prayer point out that the outer technique is only a means. The essence of this practice lies in the undivided, pure, and concentrated acclamation of the Lord in the heart, which in this connection means the depth of the soul. I also tried to practice the breathing technique recommended by the teachers of the Jesus Prayer, but soon gave it up because it proved disturbing. The recommended concentration on the heart center also soon proved to be unnecessary, because the invisible light focused on my forehead like a ray, and held my concentration there. At that time, I was charged with insulating the pipes of the heating system in a new wing of the monastery, a work that did not require much concentration on my part. It meant that I was on my own for long periods of the day, and therefore could give my full attention to the Jesus prayer. About 10 days after I began practicing with my own prayer formula, I was irresistibly drawn inside into a meditative depth that I had never experienced before. First, the little spark of the name of Jesus flared up to a blazing fire, followed by a feeling of having touched a power current and receiving an electric shock. Simultaneously, I felt a fountain springing up within me, an entirely novel experience. Awakening of the soul. Until now, my spiritual activity had come mainly from the mind, the emotions, and the senses. Now it felt to me that the consciousness of my innermost self was awakening. According to the testimony of the mystics, the entering of the transcendent into human consciousness brings about a profound change in the human being, like a person who has been sleeping and has now awoken. The term awakening to the self, or awakening to mystic consciousness, signifies the moment when a human being becomes aware of transcendent reality that often enters into his life as an experience of light. He may feel as if struck by lightning or filled to overflowing with light. After such an experience, he is no longer the same being, as is testified by many mystic practitioners. In a fraction of a second, he has gone through a transformation process that he could not have brought about by any amount of effort on his part. According to those who have had such experiences, the entry of the transcendent, divine reality into a person's life is absolutely irresistible and final. There is no room for hesitation or doubt. This experience often involves a radical turnaround in the life of such a person, as was the case, for instance, for St. Paul, and had been my own experience as a young girl of 13 years. Several times in the course of my life, God had touched my soul, and each time I had experienced the transforming effect of His touch. Footnote: the experience of being touched by the transcendental, for example, seeing transcendental light and hearing inward voices, is not an everyday experience, but neither is it an altogether extraordinary phenomenon that only saints and mystics speak about. Even people in the modern era, such as the French poet and playwright Paul Claudel and Parisian journalist André Froissart, both avowed atheists at the time of their experiences, tell of seeing supernatural light. André Froissart also heard an inner voice, which he describes in his stirring book, Dieu existe, je l'ai rencontré. God exists, I have met him. End footnote. These profound experiences had branded me, so to speak. I emerged from them as another being and felt as if nothing was quite the same as before. This would soon prove to be true once more. From that moment, I felt an overpowering urge to kneel down at this fountain of living water within me and to drink from it. But the monastic schedule allowed me few opportunities. The official worship that had meant so much to me before felt now like a curtain between God and my soul, a curtain that I was all the time trying to pull aside. The many hours that we were spending each day on the liturgy, the Opus Dei, seemed like time lost. The rites and ceremonies of the ecclesiastic worship, the sacraments and the communal prayer had not been able to open this fountain to me, and their spiritual nourishment now appeared like tasteless food. At the richly laid table of traditional piety and religiosity in the monastery, I began to hunger and thirst for food for the soul. More and more, I realized that this experience had uprooted me from the religious life I had been leading up to this point. But just as there had been no turning back when God had intervened in my life at an earlier time, so too there was no way back now. What had happened was irrevocable. The experience of transcendence did not transport me into a state of trance, yet somehow I knew that it can suspend one's everyday consciousness and help one to rise to a higher state of consciousness, where contact with the divine transcends all previous encounters. The encounter with profundities of my consciousness caught me quite unprepared. Unable to interpret what was taking place, I lived in a mist of light. It was indeed a kind of inner light experience, and in moments of inner stillness, I sometimes had a vision of a moon-like disk before me. In a way, the inner light had materialized and become visible to the physical eye. At times, it was a blazing light that blinded me, and I had to try to protect my eyes with my hands. By the experience of the deeper layer of spiritual life and the invisible presence of God within, my habit of contemplating on pictures of Jesus Christ that I had cultivated for many years was swept away. These pictures had become a veil between God and my soul, and I could not bear them any more. I therefore turned them round in my prayer books, where they served as markers. In the ensuing period, I continued studying the Philokalia very intensely. In order to have the book always at hand when I needed its advice for practicing the Jesus prayer, and because I had to return it to the library, I copied all of it by hand. I read the book so often that finally I almost knew it by heart, and its content was always with me. The Jesus prayer gradually took possession of me and changed me completely. While before, my lively temperament had led me to seek satisfaction in outward activities, this energy was now drawn inside, and all I wanted was to devote myself in silence to inner prayer. Chapter 10. The Call into the Desert. 1 year earlier, the words "Todo es nada, solo Dios basta," all is nothing, God alone suffices, had brought about a profound change in my spiritual life. Although I was then unable to grasp their whole significance, this new experience of a deeper dimension made me feel their reality. In spite of my own limitations, I now felt certain that God alone suffices. The deeper the truth of these words penetrated me, the more I also realized that all is nothing. All the time, I felt as if the fashion of this world passeth away, as St. Paul wrote to the Christian community at Corinth. I experienced this nothing as a desert in the metaphysical sense, meaning the absence of all that we can perceive with our senses and conceive with our intellect. In this state, one is confronted with the nakedness of the Absolute, as described by Meister Eckhart and experienced by all mystics. Meister Eckhart speaks in his sermons on several occasions about this desert. He says that a person who has transcended his physical body and the diversity of time will dwell in eternity, in unity, and in the desert, meaning in the divine being. He also speaks of the silent desert, into which the soul wants to merge, in the single ground of divinity. Antoinette Bourignon also speaks of this desert, saying that she asked God in her prayer, "O Lord, what must I do to please you?" Thereupon she heard a voice saying, "Give up all earthly things. Renounce your love for the creatures." "When shall I be completely your own?" she asked the Lord. She believed she heard the answer, "When you shall no longer call anything your own and will be dead to yourself." "And where should I do this, O Lord?" He answered, "In the desert." I felt this desert very intensely, yet was unable to make sense of it until a year later, when I came across a phrase by Père René Voyun, founder of the Little Brothers and Sisters of Jesus. Only in the nakedness and bareness of the desert do all the illusions dwindle away that keep us from really seeing what is buried in our hearts. To walk alone in the desert is simply unbearable for someone who is not simple and poor, and who expects from life anything but God alone. Although I had already read this statement several times, this time it penetrated my core like a flash of lightning. The mists dispelled, and I instantly understood that it was God who had sent me this desert experience, that this desert was not a place, but a state, and that it was He who had led me into this desert, just as He had led others before me. The desert will not suffer compromise. God and man stand face to face. One is simply overwhelmed by God's power, and it is impossible to escape or hide. In this merciless desert, we cannot possess anything except our own naked existence, and even this we will lose to God. But the desert conceals a secret, which is that the ultimate insecurity, the final experience of being handed over, actually confers the most profound security, the ultimate, never-to-be-lost freedom, the genuine, the true life, God. I came to this insight after approximately 1 year of desert life and noted it in my diary in order to keep a record for myself about the state I was in. In these notes, frequently taking the form of a dialogue with God, the expression, God's total claim, appears repeatedly. It was no longer just the undivided heart of my youth that He demanded. It was the total surrender of my entire being, of my whole existence to Him. The desert experience may come by way of a deep mental shock, by a heavy blow of fate, by some other deeply stirring event, or simply by the touch of the Absolute. Regardless of how it comes, those to whom it comes fall under the law of the desert, where the choice is understood to be between eternal being or not being, truth or illusion, reality or unreality, the Creator or His creatures. When that happens, evaluation of one's thoughts and actions no longer takes place by a process of intellectual reflection. There is no room for weighing right and wrong. The law functions automatically and incorruptibly, so that a person is instantly called to account for every act, and the consequences of each act are unavoidable. There still remains a certain measure of freedom to decide, but the consequences of each decision stand before one, as in a glaring light. The true significance of each choice is crystal clear. Does one choose true being or not being? Does one choose truth or illusion? Reality or unreality? The Creator or His creatures? From now on, this was the law that governed my life. Not that I always had the strength to decide in favor of eternal being, of truth, of reality, of God, but every time I opted for not being, for illusion, for unreality, for created beings, in other words, every time I opted for my own self, I was immediately aware of it, even in very trivial matters. And so the law of the desert became the measure of my life, as is so aptly stated in a poem I discovered at that time. Who once has found the desert shall not lose it again. It is not a place, it is a condition. The desert is the stillness that does not make one deaf, but gives hearing. The desert is a solitude in which one does not lose oneself, but finds oneself. The desert is not passive waiting, but an active going towards God. In that desert, Nothing is negative. Silence is not the absence of speaking. Fasting is not the absence of eating. Solitude is not lack of company. That desert is empty of all earthly things and full of divine love. In that desert, those disillusioned with life have no place. As it was unavoidable, I applied the same measure to our own monastic way of living. I compared our lives, our daily routine, the big buildings in which we lived, with the desert experience. God alone suffices was now the criterion. A great many things in my environment, which before had seemed so indispensable, did not stand the test. Gradually, the ground of our monastic life, which had once seemed so solid, began to move beneath my feet. I couldn't understand why those with whom I lived attached any importance to those things that did not seem to bring them any closer to God realization. But that was not all. The whole visible world now stood between God and my soul. Many people, including great saints, see this world as a beautiful reflection of the Creator, but to me it seemed like a dense mist. I longed to push aside everything that stood in my way and to penetrate the mist in order to finally stand before the ultimate reality, before the uncreated light. I wanted to leave behind everything that was not God, not just in my mind, but in a very concrete, very real fashion. I wanted a life in true poverty, completely bereft of all earthly objects as far as was humanly possible here on earth, and my desire grew stronger and stronger. During this phase of reorientation, the writings of the fathers of monasticism of the Christian East, collected in the Philokalia mentioned earlier, were of prime importance to me. Many of these monks had lived in the Syrian desert, in Asia Minor, in Egypt, near the Bosphorus, and later on solitary Greek islands. In their writings, I found an ideal of monastic life that imprinted itself on my heart. Seeing the exclusiveness and determination with which these men had made the search for God the sole purpose in their lives, and the one-pointedness with which they had followed their vocation, I began to view our way of life as an intolerable compromise. The desire to lead such a life in the absoluteness of the early monastic tradition became more urgent every day. More and more I came into conflict with the life that hitherto I had considered the ideal of monastic existence. Serious doubts seized me and threw me into a state of deep uneasiness. Our way of life became more and more incomprehensible to me, and I was no longer able to identify with it. I could neither ignore nor refuse the call of the desert. Little did I know that withdrawing the senses from the world, entering into the great silence before God, and detaching oneself from all transitory things must be accomplished in a totally different way. Chapter 11. The Ridge Walk. Ever since my desert experience, I had been leading a double life in the midst of the monastic community. After a while, it became clear that I could not go on like this for the rest of my life. I was now 39, because I would not be able to stand the mental pressure for much longer. One day, I was overwhelmed by an intense longing for inner peace, and suddenly the solitude of the Carthusian monastery stood before me. Deeply alarmed, I wondered whence this thought had come. Was it God who had inspired it, or had it sprung up in my imagination? I had already thought about joining a stricter order some years before, but at that time it had not been a serious matter. Now it seemed clear that my outer life would have to change as a consequence of the desert experience. For months on end I pondered the issue, analyzed my experiences, and wrote down my reflections and conclusions in search of clarity. I needed to look objectively at my inner evolution and then examine whether I had drawn the right conclusions from my experience. Until I was sure about what prompted me to leave the monastery, the call of God or my own wishes, I felt unable to act. My conscience would not allow it. After having minutely analyzed all the pros and cons, I was convinced that part of my recent experiences was a true call into the desert, a call that I had to follow. But how was I to do this? The how was shrouded in utter darkness. Many months passed until finally, after the demise of our mother abbess, I was able to speak with her successor about my vocation. She was understandably shocked when I told her about my intention of leaving the monastery and changing to a stricter order, but she left me free to find my own way. My request for admission to the Carthusian nuns brought a kind and sympathetic answer containing, however, such a definite and final decline of my request that there was not the slightest hope for me of changing over to that order. Although I had been prepared for a negative answer, the refusal was such a stunning blow that for days on end I was unable to think calmly and reasonably. I felt deeply troubled, thinking that now I had to give up the desert ideal forever. For the first time in my life, I felt as though I was hanging over an abyss. Some 10 days later, I calmed down sufficiently to recall that experience of the desert which had been such a turning point in my life. With all my strength, I fought against my inner despair and, in an act of faith and blind confidence, I threw myself into God's arms. I came to understand that I could thank Him for suspending my life over an abyss, and thus giving me the chance to leap into the void and deliver myself utterly to Him. This was not to be the last time that God demanded this death leap. It seemed to be His method of education, preparing one for an unquestioning surrender to Him. It became clear that this unconditional submission to God was from now on my only chance of survival, although for me it felt more like death than life. And such a moment does indeed evoke a feeling of ex inanitio, of being extinguished or annihilated, an agonizing emptying of oneself. It is not the fear of physical death, but rather the fear of giving up everything that we consider vital for the maintenance of our self-consciousness. Our feeling, thinking, knowing, and wanting. The mystics of all religions make mention of this experience, put into words by Bernard of Clairvaux. O Lord, it is a constant dying when one desires to gain you. And the same is meant in the Katha Upanishad when it says, "The path to God goes over the edge of a sharp razor." In order to encounter God, the seeker must, according to a frequently used expression from the Middle Ages, cross the bridge to the beyond. In an analogy for physical death, which entails leaving behind all transitory things, including one's own body, the seeker here must abandon himself before being able to cross the threshold to a life with God. The road to the Carthusian convent having been blocked, I made another attempt to gain an inch of the desert for myself and contacted Père Voyun, whose words about the call to the desert had had such a profound effect on me a few months earlier. His answer was very kind. He suggested the possibility of applying for admission to a strictly contemplative community in the south of France. Still, what he wrote remained quite vague, and I realized that I still had a long way to go in order to reach a goal that was still shrouded in darkness. My second letter to Père Voyun, written in October 1963, was not answered. I did not know that he had been in North Africa for several months, and that his mail had not been forwarded to him. In the meantime, by reading magazines found in our library, I became aware of the many efforts being made within the monastic orders to reinvigorate monastic life by returning to the simplicity and strictness of earlier times and giving more emphasis to the Oratio Pura, the contemplative prayer that Saint Benedict speaks of in his Rule. It was no small consolation to me to find that I was not alone, and I felt encouraged to persevere in my search for a life nearer to this ideal. In those magazines, I also found some articles about life in the desert, and I received permission to contact one of the authors, Sœur Marie from Paris. India on the horizon. While I was still waiting for an answer from Père Voyun, my mother sent me a circular letter from one of my former friends in the youth organization, who some years back had set up a leper colony in northern India. India? The country's age-old spiritual tradition was known to me from the writings of Rabindranath Tagore. Although my knowledge was quite vague, I knew enough to take this letter as a hint from God. I wrote to my old friend asking her about life in India, but without mentioning my real reason for writing. Having no idea of what had moved me, and without answering my questions, she wrote about the visit of a Christian monk, Père Lesseau, who was leading the life of a sannyasi, a renunciant who seeks the divine within, in India. He had taken the Indian name Swami Abhishektananda, which signifies joy in the Anointed One, Christ. To adopt an Indian name and to wear the clothing of an Indian sannyasi was for Christian monks the outer sign of integration into the culture of India. Together with his companion, Abbe Monchanin, he had founded the contemplative Christian ashram, Shantivanam, Forest of Peace, in the south of India. About this ashram and its concept, they had written the book, Eremites du Satchidananda, The Hermits of Satchidananda, which had recently been published in German. Footnote: Satchidananda is a Sanskrit term in Indian philosophy describing the essence of God. It is a compound term combining Sat, being, truth, Chit, consciousness, and Ananda, bliss. This name is employed by Indian Christian theologians as a synonym for the Holy Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. End footnote. My friend's letter literally brought me down on my knees. Did God want me in India? I must be out of my mind, I said to myself, for even considering that possibility. Nevertheless, this day turned out to be the day on which my vocation for India was born. A few days later, when I held the book in my hands, I realized that these two monks were living exactly the kind of monastic life that I envisaged for myself. Then, to my complete astonishment, in the middle of January 1964, I received a letter from Père Voyun in Marseille. He was proposing to intervene on my behalf with the responsible bishop in order to facilitate my joining the contemplative community in the south of France, which he had mentioned before. However, because my vocation was now pulling me towards India, I disregarded this proposal and turned instead to Swami Abhishektananda. From reading his book, I felt as though I already knew him quite well, and I wrote to him about my desert experience, asking him whether he saw a way for me to follow the call into the desert in India. I had to wait for 3 months for his answer, which was sobering. Wanting to come alone to India as a member of a strictly cloistered order is an adventurous idea, he wrote back. He was surely right, yet he ended with a decisive sentence. But if God wants you to be here, it will be shown. I clung to those words as one would cling to a prophecy. On 26 February 1964, I received a letter from Sœur Marie from Paris, to whom I had turned for contact with a Hermetic monk. The answer given was, "If the Lord wants a change in your vocation, He will intervene at His hour and in His way." I was quite convinced of the truth of this, and I awaited God's intervention with unshakable confidence. At Easter 1964, there was another completely unexpected turn of events. An acquaintance who knew about my problems wrote to me about a small monastic community, the Sisters of the Virgin of the Poor, which was in Bourriquot in France. There, the ideal I aspired to was being put into practice. The sisters led a strictly contemplative life based on communal poverty and complete remoteness from the world. What to make of this hint? Did God want me there, after first having put the idea of India into my mind? My path seemed to be full of sudden turns, and they always made me afraid that the next step would take me into the void. Each time it proved to be just a sharp turn in the path, after which I still had firm ground under my feet, but only just enough ground for my next step, and never more than that. Before contacting Père Hermine Leclerc, the founder of the small community at Bourriquot, I wanted to wait for Swami Abhishektananda's answer, but it was a long time coming, so I finally decided to write to Père Hermine. He replied, "Unfortunately, our sisters do not accept professed sisters from other orders or congregations." They had had too many unfortunate experiences with such conversions, and they did not want to take the risk again. Not wanting to give up so quickly, I wrote them a second letter with more details about my motives. While waiting for their answer, I received a letter from India at last. My letter had been traveling around the Himalayas for 10 weeks before it finally reached the wandering monk. In his reply, Swami Abhishektananda painted a gloomy picture of the problems that would await me in India, and I myself felt apprehensive about the problems I might face as a Catholic nun coming to India without any specific plan to found a cloister. Since I had in the meantime contacted the community of the Sisters of the Virgin of the Poor and was still hoping that they would grant me admission, I gave in to the fear that the Swami's letter had awakened in me. I wrote back to him, saying that under the circumstances I did not see how I could go to India. The obstacles seemed insurmountable. However, the reply to my second letter to the community at Bourriquot contained a loving but final refusal, and before I could answer it, there was another letter from Swami Abhishektananda in which he tried to soften the effect of the previous one. He wrote to say that I should take everything into consideration, and then, if I still felt like coming to India, I should make a decision. More than ever, I now felt like a plaything in God's hands. Some years later, I would read in the teachings of the Masters that we are all puppets in the hands of the Divine Puppet Master, and that the whole creation is his Leela, his play. Since all other roads were barred, and only the way to India was left open, I was determined to take it. I had no other choice, for even the slightest thought of abandoning the desert forever filled me with dismay and made me feel that desperation was pulling me into an abyss, for I knew that if I renounced the desert, I could never find inner peace. As Père Voyun had once written to a brother who was in a similar situation, "You will only find peace by answering the call of God." For a long time I had felt as though I was walking along a narrow, steep ridge. My path to God had become a ridge walk, and the abysses on both sides were equally threatening. On one side there was a feeling of desperation. Often the thought came up in my mind that the whole thing was only self-deception, that there was nobody who had called me, and that there was no goal I was striving for. On the other side, and no less frightening, there was the temptation of what in German is called Selbstherrlichkeit, which means making one's own decisions in an arrogant and self-centered way, instead of living in a state of submission. It felt like walking on a razor's edge, for in spite of my desert experience, I was never absolutely sure whether I was on the right way. Had not thousands of men and women dedicated their lives to God in the order of Saint Benedict, and followed the way of perfection according to his rule? Why should I be any different? Sometimes during this ridge walk, I was tempted to stop and to turn, at least for a moment, in order to look back at the years when I had been happy in my monastery. But then I felt as if somebody was standing behind me with a drawn sword in his hand, someone who wouldn't even let me turn my head. He would rather kill me than let me look back. Again and again I was tempted to say to myself, "Enough of this, take your life into your own hands again." On one occasion I did give in to this temptation, and I fell into the abyss. Often I felt like an uprooted plant, lying on the ridge in the scorching sun. I prayed insistently to God, begging Him not to leave me with my roots withering, but to plant me where I was destined to grow. I fervently longed to be rooted in soil that would nourish me, but another 12 months would pass before this happened. It was like an experience of death, an experience through which I had to go. Every time I affirmed my willingness to persevere on the ridge, I had to lay down my life at God's feet. I went through this death 100 times a day, in fact. Every time I thought about my situation, I felt as though I was face to face with death, but death turned into life as soon as I surrendered unconditionally to the will of God. In spite of everything, the walk along the ridge was also glorious, for it made me experience God's invisible presence, and it obliged me to look at Him ceaselessly. It was His gaze that drew my gaze to Him, and that cured me of my vertigo in the face of the abysses on both sides of the path. This eye-to-eye contact with my invisible companion on the ridge was a permanent source of strength that helped me to persevere through this phase, and made the next step possible. Not that I ever actually saw any face or eyes looking at me, but there was a clearly felt yet invisible gaze that I was able to respond to, and that made me certain of the presence of that unknown one to whom I had dedicated my life. Chapter 12. Who are you, O Lord? For 27 years I had been following the unknown one whom I called God. First He had demanded my undivided heart, and then He had led me into the Garden Inclosed, so that I should belong to no one but Him. After that, He had enticed me into the desert. Finally, He made me walk the razor's edge in order to bring me to the place where He wanted me to be. By now, I had encountered Him in countless hidden ways, and had ventured to follow Him so many times that He truly had become my destiny. But who was He? In May 1964, I put before Him my question about His identity in the form of a prayer. Who are you, Lord? You, to whom I abandon my life, whom I follow on a steep and dark path, step by step. You, who enticed me into the desert. Who are you, Lord, for whom I go through fire and water, for whom I suffer to the limits of my strength? Who are you, that you have such power over me, that you chain me to you, that you do not leave me free, that I cannot avert my gaze from you? Who are you, that you have become my fate? Who are you, who became the center and the object of my life and my thoughts? Who are you, that I cannot leave you, even if I were to lose my life? I do not know you, Lord, yet you are close to me. I have never seen you, but your countenance shines over me. I have never heard you, but I know your voice. Lord, it is you into whom I plunged. It is you who fell upon me like fire. You are that eagle who dropped on his prey. You intervened into the depth of my life. It is you whom I encountered in the desert. It is you for whom I wait, whom I set out to meet. It is you in whom I put all my trust, to whom all my love belongs. You, my Lord and God. This prayer was an attempt to find an answer to my question to the Unknown One. But there was no answer other than my remembrance of his work as I had experienced it. The question of who he was remained unanswered. I was sure of only one thing. He was not the God of the theologians and scribes, of the philosophers and the scholars of religion. He was the living God. He had broken into my life forcefully, and there was no escape. The question in my prayer can only be answered fully at a higher level of consciousness, where the Unknown One reveals himself to the soul. But this does not mean that such prayers are useless, for when we try, we find that our efforts awaken within us a longing to know God, and this longing is at least a preliminary answer to our prayers. This longing is of great importance in the spiritual quest. There is a story told by Sri Ramakrishna, a fervent seeker of God and a spiritual teacher in India. An ardent disciple asked of his guru, "When will I have the vision of God?" Instead of giving a direct answer, the guru took the novice to the seashore and held his head under water for a while. Then he asked him how it felt. "I thought I would die for want of air to breathe," came the answer. Such a longing for God would reveal him immediately, was the answer given by the Master. Chapter 13. To the Promised Land. Now all doors were barred. Only the door to India remained open, and I had no doubt that India was my promised land. God would take me there. Of that I was sure. The long ridge walk had made me fearless. Every obstacle that blocked my way now made me stronger and filled me with even more inner assurance. Intuitively, I sensed that I was on the right path, although I could not have given a rational explanation for this. Not that there was ever a way in the sense of a perceptible path, for at best I was able to see only the next step. My inner guide did not let me see more than this. As Père de Caussade confirms, when God gives himself as a guide to a soul, he can rightly demand that she follow him unconditionally, without getting uneasy about the way on which he will lead her. The soul will be prompted without seeing the path ahead. The way ahead is neither where the soul sees it, nor as she expects it to be. Seeing the way ahead is the way of the ego, which cannot do otherwise. It cannot take the risk. God's ways, however, are always new. He does not ride on beaten tracks, but always paves new ways. Under his guidance, a soul does not know where the journey goes. Neither books nor reasoning are of any help. The workings of the divine constantly reveal the next move. Under his impulse alone, she goes on her way. All that I knew of the way were the steps that lay behind me. By now, I was in regular correspondence with Swami Abhishektananda. In one of his letters, received on 16th September 1964, he took up the question of my vocation for India. His impression was that I had chosen India for the fulfillment of my personal vocation for the desert. While such a vocation was a necessary prerequisite, it would not be enough. Whoever has a vocation for India, he wrote, comes in order to fulfill an ecclesiastic mission, helping to make real the presence of the Christian Church, either by living the monastic way of life or in some other way. Swami Abhishektananda did not mention a definite missionary task. He had never envisaged that for himself, and I would never have accepted any missionary work in India. In his letter, he demanded to know if I had received some clear indications from the Lord that would allow me to proceed on a course that seemed otherwise unwise and adventurous. If he thought that I had chosen India for the fulfillment of my personal vocation, Swami Abhishektananda no doubt was right. At the same time, I was also convinced that God had chosen me for India. His intentions were unknown to me. They would be unveiled step by step once I was actually living in India. Nevertheless, I reflected on Swami Abhishektananda's serious objections and thus discovered another dimension of my vocation for India. Wherever I found myself in the end, it would be my task to bear witness that God alone suffices. I was to live my vocation for the desert. When I had read Eremiten von Sachidananda, Hermits of Sachidananda, I had realized that such a testimony was of fundamental importance for the Catholic Church in India. In my reply to Swami Abhishektananda, I explained that I envisaged a life of prayer, contemplation, and true poverty, in accordance with the ideal of the early monastic tradition as it is presented in the Philokalia. I also told him that I believed the desert experience had predestined me for India. This exchange of letters seemed to be taking me into a new phase. New horizons opened before me, and I sensed a wonderful inner freedom and ease, as I had now diverted my attention away from myself and was seeing my future in India in a wider context. In the summer of 1964, while such reflections on my vocation still continued to occupy my mind, I had a visit from my uncle, Dr. Clemens Tillman, a Catholic priest. My mother had told him about my problems, and he was very concerned. After a long talk, however, he said that he was also convinced that God stood behind it all, and that he was willing to intervene on my behalf with the church authorities in Rome. In a letter to me later on, he summed up his conclusions from our discussions. I came to you with a number of questions and doubts, but our talk has made it abundantly clear that the events you mention are not an illusion. When everything works out so perfectly in all aspects, it can only come from one source, from God. I felt a deep joy about your vocation, and I am glad that I can contribute in a modest way towards its realization. With all my heart, I shall accompany you on your path. After receiving this letter, I wrote to Swami Abhishektananda again, for I was now able to show him that there really were clear indications that God had called me to India, as he had demanded. His reply to my letter came as a great relief. In this way you have successfully countered all my objections, he wrote. The fact that my uncle was himself convinced about my vocation impressed him very much. Dr. Tillman was the co-author of the new German catechism that had been published after the Second World War. Moreover, he was an experitus, expert, at the Second Vatican Council in Rome, 1962 to 1965. Swami Abhishektananda told me that he had heard enough about Dr. Tillman to realize that he was not an ordinary man. After all the years of searching, waiting, and worrying, this was the first positive reaction to any of the countless letters I had written. With immense relief, I could now focus on my goal. During the preceding weeks, Swami Abhishektananda had arranged a visit by Dr. Bettina Boehmer, a young theologian from Vienna with a degree in Indology, who had been in India. She told me about her experiences, and we quickly became friends. It was our hope that in a few years' time, we and other sisters from Europe might be able to lead together a life in the spirit of the Hermits of Sachidananda. Our plans turned out to be impracticable because of the differences in our respective backgrounds and in our concepts of community life were too great. Later, when we met in India, it soon became clear we would each have to go our own way. A deep fall. In 1965, it was time to take up the matter of my going to India with the Congregation for Religious, the relevant church authority in Rome. For help in formulating my request, I turned to a fellow brother of the Abbey of Boiron, Father Paulus. I knew this Benedictine monk from his articles in various religious magazines, and at the end of March, he was able to come to Kellenried. Before that, our Mother Abbess had discussed my plans with the senior sisters of our community, without me present, alas. It was here that the idea was first voiced that I should apply for dispensation from my vows in order to be free to do what I considered to be the will of God. To me, it seemed unthinkable that a member of an order could ever even conceive of such an idea, and I was shocked by the thought of having to take back my promise to God. When we met, Father Paulus himself made the same suggestion within the first quarter of an hour. He had previously promised to help me, but under the influence of the Mother Abbess, he must have retreated from that position. In the most insistent of terms, he now pointed out all the dark sides of my adventure and confronted me with a choice between remaining in the monastery or getting dispensation from my vows. For him, there was no alternative. Since he judged me unable to take such a decision at that moment, he suggested to me that I should spend some time in a Benedictine abbey in another country in order to gain some distance from the whole problem. This seemed to be a reasonable proposal, and since it was made in such a kind and concerned way, I immediately agreed to it. In reality, it was an arbitrary attempt, even if made with the best of intentions, to intervene and change my plans. I was so exhausted, physically and mentally, that the prospect of spending a year in a haven of peace appealed to me immensely, so much so that I accepted without hesitation. Quite unawares, I had for a moment lost eye-to-eye contact with the invisibly present One, and I had tumbled instantly into the abyss of Selbstherrlichkeit. I felt magically attracted by its depths before I realized what dangers were lurking there. India was by now lost from sight, as I concentrated all my energy on the new project. I immediately began to study French, since in the week of Pentecost I was to go to Valognes in Normandy. Recently, this abbey had founded a new monastery in Africa, and I was told that perhaps one day I would be able to go there. This was all done to take my mind off India. What took place in my mind in the weeks that followed is simply indescribable. Once separated from the goal God had fixed for me, I became a plaything of my own imagination. Countless ideas for the future arose in my head, all somehow ending in a mist of very vague ideas. I also realized that Valognes would be a real trap for me, where I would only retrieve my inner peace if I decided at the outset to forget about my experience of the desert. The ridge walk would have been no more than a vain escapade, something to be forgotten as quickly as possible. Some weeks passed in this way, during which I shed more tears than ever before. One day, horror gripped me in the face of the dense mists in which my life was floundering, and I realized that God was in no way truly present in all these considerations. I gathered all my strength, shed the projections of my fancy, and placed myself inwardly before God. Over and over again I asked him for forgiveness for my presumptuous planning, and prayed to him fervently to save me once more from going my own way. In this hour, I retrieved my faith in his guidance and in my vocation for India. I gradually felt strong enough to follow this path, no matter how far away the goal or how much torment and frustration I would have to endure. Again, I climbed up onto the ridge and directed my eyes towards God. Instantly, the mists dissolved, and from then on, a wonderful certainty filled me. I was convinced that God would yet bring me to the promised land. The next day, I confessed to our Mother Abbess that I was determined to continue on my way to India, whereupon she in turn told me what had induced her to consent to the plan to send me to Valognes. She had thought that such a postponement would be the end of my plans. However, as Père Voyun had written to a brother in a similar situation, nothing weakens a person more, and nothing is more barren, like an endless circle, than only to ponder with the intellect about truths and values without ever putting them into practice in one's own life. The Last Leap. After focusing on India once again, the first thing I had to do was apply to the church authorities in Rome for permission to leave the monastery. What I needed was an exclaustratio ad experimentum, a kind of test period outside the monastery. In my case, it would have to be an exceptional permission, because it was normally necessary either to be a member of a founding group or to join an existing new monastery in India. Neither of these applied in my case. As was to be expected, my request was declined by the Congregation for Religious, and they hinted at the possibility of my vows being suspended. While not actually feeling discouraged by the refusal, I was at a loss about my next step. 2 days later, the Lord put me back on my feet. I shall never forget the moment. It was after the communal prayer in the afternoon. I had entered my room and remained for a moment in silence. My inner gaze was directed towards God, and I asked, "What now, Lord?" Inwardly, I was completely calm. I was sure that He would answer me in one way or another. Then I heard the voice that had spoken to me once before, long ago. In clear and distinct words, it said, "Get back on your feet. Make a general attack. Fight. I am with you." Instantly, I felt great courage, and I knew immediately what to do. The Lord Himself had taken up the banner and called on me to fight, no doubt about that. I later found in a book confirmation of my conviction that it was God who had spoken to me. Whoever accepts the possibility that the Creator can contact man in the form of unarticulated suggestions or inspirations, by which the Divine Spirit influences the soul and mind of a human being, to him it will not appear impossible that this same Divine Spirit can even reveal Himself with an articulated voice that is inwardly audible. First I asked my uncle, Dr. Tillman, who 6 months ago had offered his help, for a letter of reference. Then I asked the former principal of the Catholic Organization of Social Work for Girls for a recommendation, as I had worked under her and she knew me well. I also asked Father Paulus from Boiron, who was a member of the Mission Council of our order, but he felt unable to write a recommendation for me. Years later, however, he did facilitate my participation at the Congress of the Monastic Orders in Asia, which took place in Bangkok. On 21st June 1965, I again sent in my application for exclaustration to the congregation in Rome, along with the recommendations I had obtained. Next, I attacked the matter of a visa for India. I planned to go first to my friend Agnes Kunz in Dehradun in northern India, in order to help her with her work there. She had founded a leper colony there 6 years before and was doing admirable work. From there, I was going to try to make contacts that would bring me closer to a life in the spirit of the hermits of Sachidananda. Unfortunately, the help in getting a visa that had been promised by a supporter of the leper colony failed. However, Bettina Boehmer, when visiting me some time earlier in Kellenried, had happened to mention a possible way of getting a visa for India. In spring 1965, she had met a Greek nun, Sister Leela, who belonged to the International Secretariat for Study and Service Exchange in New Delhi. The aim of this organization was to promote the encounter between Hindus and Christians. Its founder, Major Ramachandra, was a disciple of Mahatma Gandhi. Now, Bettina Boehmer's passing remark was to prove most providential. Soon we would experience for ourselves the meaning of the words of Jesus Christ. Said I not unto thee that, if thou wouldest believe, thou shouldest see the glory of God? Bettina Boehmer wrote immediately to Major Ramachandra and received in reply a kind and personal letter that was very encouraging. A few days later, I also received a letter from him. He suggested that, together with Sister Leela, I should visit a number of ashrams in India and then decide on the one that suited me best. He himself had a specific ashram in mind, and much later, after having taken quite a circuitous route, I did indeed end up there. The Indian consulate gave me an entry visa that could be extended every year. In the meantime, Rome had granted my exclaustratio ad experimentum, so that there was now only one last problem to solve. I needed money to make the journey and to meet the cost of living in India, at least for the first few months. Even in this matter, I experienced God's help in such a tangible way that it was astounding. Within 2 weeks, I had enough funds for my flight and plenty to spare. Our Mother Abbess gave me a few weeks' holiday so that I could get some rest before my departure and prepare myself for the entirely new life that lay ahead of me. I already had the plane ticket in my pocket and my suitcase was packed when, 5 days before the actual departure, I received a letter from Swami Abhishektananda that read, "There is war between India and Pakistan. Don't come now." It isn't hard to imagine the shock this letter caused in me. I had burned all my bridges. What to do now? I adopted the approach that had worked for me so many times before and threw myself into God's arms, saying, "Lord, I had to arrange the date of my departure, but you will determine when it actually happens." Still, I was deeply disturbed, not least because our Mother Abbess was unwilling to let me come back to the monastery. She may have feared that I would cause a disturbance. But I insisted on returning, and some days later I was on my way back to Kellenreid. 2 days before the date of my departure, a second letter from Swami Abhishektananda arrived, saying, "The war does not seem to escalate. If you have courage, come." Furthermore, he gave me directions for my arrival in Mumbai, Bombay, in case he could not meet me at the airport because of the war. Actually, however, India and Pakistan ended their hostilities on the day of my departure, another reassuring sign telling me to surrender completely to God's will. Never was I to feel that I had the situation in hand. He had destined me for India, and the reasons would be revealed to me one by one, once I began living there. The evening before my departure, I was deeply moved as I said farewell to my fellow sisters in the monastery. Most of them had had no clue about my plans. Some shed tears, some gave me their good wishes and promised to pray for me, and some were truly upset. I also felt the pain of parting because I loved my fellow sisters. Although friendships between us were strictly forbidden, I felt deeply attached to some of my companions. Now I left them after 16 years of communal living in the monastery. It was especially painful to go away without giving them any reason, because I had not been allowed to explain anything to them. So we embraced each other in silent sadness. My monastic family would stay behind, walking their well-marked path, while for me there was a new beginning, traveling alone on an unmarked road. During that last night in the monastery where I had spent the last 16 years of my life, it became clear to me that the next morning was going to be for me a moment of truth. Until now, my spiritual journey had all taken place inside me. In a sense, it had been unreal, like a figment of my imagination that might evaporate into thin air at any moment. Even the concrete steps I had taken, especially the voluminous correspondence and finally the packing of my bags, had all taken place within the 4 walls of the monastery. Tomorrow, everything would be different, for I would leave the safety of my monastic home and step out into a completely unknown future. Except for an address and some vague plans, I had nothing to give me any feeling of security. The next morning, I would know the truth about the one in whom I had believed and in whom I had put all my trust. Now I would find out whether I had been chasing a phantom or following my true vocation. Were it not for the fact that God was standing behind all this, I would surely have been filled with fear. What would await me the next day I knew not. I only knew that I would have to face once more the full consequences of my adventure of faith. I had no idea whether it would be joy or fear, relief or anxiety. But when I finally let myself drift away into sleep, I was quite calm. When I actually crossed the threshold of the monastery the next day, I felt as if someone received me with open arms, someone I did not see, yet whose presence I felt very intensely. It was out of the question that I might have created this feeling in myself. Not only was I far from expecting or even desiring any such experience, but it was far beyond anything I could have imagined. The inner security it brought would never leave me for the rest of my life. As I left my monastery on 25th September 1965, the ridge walk was at an end. Now, in India, the tightrope was awaiting me. Chapter 14. Recognizing the Will of God. In all the years of which these pages give account, I was often confronted with the question of what God wanted me to do. How could I know His will? What right had I to say that something was His will when I made decisions that did not fit into the traditional framework of recognizing and executing the will of God? Certain experiences and events led me to draw a number of very personal conclusions. These conclusions were no doubt subjective, and others might question them, but for me there was no alternative. Most of the time I acted intuitively, and sometimes I acted contrary to accepted notions about the will of God, but I always tried to be clear about my own motives, as I have explained in previous chapters. Apart from the 2 occasions when I received direct instructions from a distinct inner voice, I had to depend largely on my intuition. But what is this intuition? At that time, I called it my conscience and felt it to have a radar-like capacity to receive impulses that come not from the sphere of sense perceptions and reason, but from a transcendent reality to which the senses and the intellect do not have access. Intuition is inherent in every human being, but I felt that my experiences of transcendence enhanced this capacity, and I became more receptive to the impulses of the power that I called God. I often experienced this power as overwhelming and inescapable, and I did everything I could to remain connected to it. I tried to look with a constant gaze at this invisible but very much present power, for not only did I receive inner guidance, but it was and continues to be the source of life for me. Intuition cannot be controlled or evaluated by the intellect. That is why I was often told that my decisions were unwise, irrational, and adventurous. Yet deep in my heart I knew that I could not have decided otherwise. Every time I gave way to rational arguments, I would become profoundly uneasy and bewildered. On the other hand, when I allowed my intuition to guide me, I received confirmation in my heart that I had drawn the right conclusions from my experiences. Time and again, surprising avenues opened before me that indicated the next step on a path where I was profoundly convinced God was leading me. If, however, for some reason or other the path was blocked, I knew that it was not the will of God that I should proceed. Such knowledge did not come from any rational process of thought, but from an attitude of acceptance of events I could not influence. But I did not rely exclusively on my intuition. I would have considered that to be presumptuous, for on many occasions there was no generally accepted norm against which I could evaluate decisions. Instead, I looked for guidance and advice from experienced men and women who were themselves members of an order. Most of all, I searched the books that I had at my disposal, looking for ways in which I could find out the will of God. Père de Caussade had taught me submission to divine providence, which comes by way of unavoidable fate. That is Père de Caussade's definition of the recognizable will of God, to which one must submit, or rather surrender. This acknowledgement of God's will may be called passive. However, we are often forced to take decisions, and sometimes these decisions, which we want to be in accordance with the will of God, have far-reaching implications. Here, Père de Caussade's letters failed to provide an answer to me. His letters appeared to give no advice about the active recognition of the will of God. They seemed to be addressed to readers who were mostly members of a religious order and no longer had to take any decisions themselves. I did, however, find an article about guidance through the Holy Spirit in a periodical published by the Jesuits. It presented the rules of St. Ignatius of Loyola concerning the recognition of the will of God. In speaking about the two ways to recognize the divine will, he gives very concrete instructions. The first way consists in pondering upon and reflecting on what benefits and advantages one might receive and what disadvantages and dangers could arise if the decision is made exclusively for the praise of God and the salvation of one's soul. One should also reflect on the advantages and benefits, and the disadvantages and dangers which would arise if one chose another route. Next, one should observe to which side reason inclines more, and follow the intellect rather than the senses. Once the decision is taken, one should fervently pray to God to accept his choice and to let him know whether his decision was taken according to God's will or not. The second way to recognize the will of God is meant for those who are already experienced in the spiritual life. The love that motivates and pushes a person to decide in favor of a certain action must come from above, prompted by the love for God. One must first perceive in oneself whether or not the particular preference for the chosen objective is aimed exclusively at God. As a help in taking a decision, Ignatius of Loyola particularly emphasizes the experience of inner solace or forlornness. According to him, the decisive means of knowing is the experience of divine consolation, a kind of objectless solace that does not pertain to earthly things. The soul is filled with an unearthly joy and deep inner peace without knowing its origin, and she simply feels a powerful pull towards God and all things divine. Great strength emanates from this solace. Ignatius further adds, "The one lesson God himself teaches us, in order that we may know the will of God, consists of the consolation that expels all confusion from the soul and draws it exclusively to the love of God." One thing, however, must be particularly emphasized. Such consolation is obtained only through the inner connection in which one's gaze invisibly meets the gaze of God. When one is connected to God in this way, one is entirely free of worries about the course of events, because now it is up to God to ensure that his will is fulfilled. I hardly ever prayed that everything I considered to be God's will would be fulfilled. I believed and trusted that God himself would accomplish his work. Certainly, one develops a feeling for what is the will of God, provided there is a sincere wish to know and to fulfill it, just as it is possible to sharpen the conscience to sense what is contrary to his will. It is this sensitization of the conscience that is of primary importance. It is a learning process through which the seeker of God has to go. When one's thinking and will are directed towards God, one learns to listen to those inner impulses that make one more sincere in one's intentions, purer in one's attitude, and more selfless in one's actions. This will bring one closer to God, and one will find it ever easier to know the will of God. And when one keeps receiving the confirmation that one's decisions were true to God, one's inner certainty in the recognition of God's will grows accordingly. Theologians and scribes of the world religions may think they can give us hard and fast rules concerning the will of God. Their lists of do's and don'ts are all broadly similar. However, the question then arises as to whether those who don't care about the will of God are still living in his will, or is it possible that they avoid fulfilling his will by ignoring or simply overlooking it? In the case of such people, God's will is simply executed, just as it is in the case of any irrational creature, and just as it is throughout the entire creation. Anyone who tries to resist the will of God will have to learn by experience.